Have you ever stumbled across a story so disturbing it clings to your mind for days, keeping you awake at night? What if I told you Reddit holds some of the most terrifying, bone-chilling horror stories you've ever heard, buried deep within its threads? Today, we dive into the darkest corners of Reddit, uncovering 3 stories that are not for the faint of heart. When my little brother Jerry got married, I was asked to step in as a bridesmaid for his wife-to-be. The guest list was a little thin on the bride's side, and he figured it'd be a good bonding experience. His fiancée, Susie, came from a small rural community back in Minnesota and didn't have a lot of family. Jerry had briefly mentioned that she was an orphan and that it was sort of an off-limit topic to bring up. Not that I'd planned to. Susie and Jerry had met during his studies at MSU, and they'd been together for over 6 years before they made it official. These were 2 people who were more or less married already. On their wedding day, I tried my best to cater to Susie's needs. She seemed a bit down, but I figured it was just cold feet. I didn't want to pressure her, so I held my tongue and observed. There were a lot of little things that stood out to me. The way she sighed at her reflection, the way her eyes sunk when she saw the flower arrangements. She didn't say anything, but there was a sort of lulling discontent on her face. As we waited for the dress, I found her pouting on an ottoman outside the bathroom. I joined her, giving her a curious look. "It's all beautiful," I assured her. "All of it. I can tell you put a lot of thought into it." "It's not a big deal," she smiled, "but it's not perfect. I mean, nothing is, but you know." "I get it, yeah," I nodded. "Nothing's perfect." "It's not that, it's like..." She turned in her seat, facing me with a furrowed brow. "Nothing is really truly beautiful. It's all right, but nothing is like I want it to be." "What would you change then?" I asked. "If you had more time?" "That's just the thing," she groaned. "I have no idea. It's just a feeling, you know." There were a couple of surprises for Susie, though. Jerry had gone out of his way to make her happy. He had managed to track down her mother's wedding dress, something that had been put up for auction years ago when some of the family's estate was sold off to pay for Susie's education. He'd also made a bridal bouquet from the vivid pink flowers that grew in the backyard of her childhood home. These were all surprises, but he had backups on backups if she didn't like them, green flags all around. When the dress arrived, Susie got this strange expression on her face, like recognition, disbelief and amazement all rolled into one. She cracked a smile and twirled around the room with it, hugging it like an old friend. It was certainly unique, an old-fashioned blend between a drop waist and empire cut. She held the dress up and stared at a mirror, speaking to me without looking away. "It's not perfect, but it's getting there," she smiled. "It's almost like I picture it. I feel it." I handed her the bridal bouquet, watching the blue petals reflect in her eyes. "I really do feel it right here." She put her hand on her stomach, smiling from ear to ear. The ceremony itself was beautiful. The walk down the aisle, the exchanging of vows. They walked out of the church to a church organ rendition of Tom Jones's Chills and Fever. That was also the first dance they shared at the reception. While my focus was on Jerry, I couldn't help but to look over at Susie every now and then. I caught her looking at her reflection a couple of times. She'd peer over the counter of the open bar and stare at herself in the mirror wall. I also noticed a bit of hesitance to throw the bridal bouquet. She couldn't keep her eyes off the blue petals. It's like she was mesmerized and wanted to keep it to herself. All in all, it turned into a good night. Lots of laughs, drinks and dancing, but I couldn't help but to notice something strange in Susie's eyes, a light that wasn't there earlier that day. A couple of days turned into weeks and life went on. I forgot about Susie and her wedding dress. That is, until Jerry called me up. He wanted to have lunch and catch up. Jerry and I have always had a good relationship, but we didn't really spend time on our own. We mostly just met for big events. To have him willingly seek me out rang some alarm bells. I met him at a cafe downtown. I had a sandwich. He got nothing, not even coffee. I could tell he was trying to keep a brave face, but there were worrying signs. I caught him yawning, and he had a slight shake to his hands. Something was clearly bothering him. I tried to get a read of him with some small talk, but it wasn't long until the conversation took a turn. "I want to talk about the wedding," he said. "Did Susie say something when she saw that dress?" "She loved it," I said, chewing on my sandwich. "Really loved it." Yeah, but did she say anything? Anything strange? She mentioned it not being perfect, I nodded. But getting there, you know? Getting there. Yeah, like... I shrugged. I didn't know how to explain it. In fact, as I looked back on it, I had no idea what she meant. It felt like an off-the-shoulder comment, but maybe there was more to it. Jerry held his hands up. Look, he sighed, we've been having issues. Turns out their honeymoon didn't turn out as magical as one was led to believe. Susie had been obsessing over that wedding dress all week long. Jerry had once walked in on her wearing it in the bathroom, crying over how she wouldn't get a chance to wear it again. She said it made her feel beautiful, he explained, and how rare that was. Not wanting to see her sad on the first week of their life together, Jerry had just gone along with whatever Susie asked of him. She'd been wearing that dress pretty much all day long, even sleeping in it a couple of nights. For passers-by, it had been an amusing oddity, but Jerry was getting worried. Susie was having trouble keeping it together, and ever since they got back home, her behavior had taken a turn for the worse. Jerry had trouble talking about it. He kept touching his face, as if trying to hide what he was saying. He'd find Susie getting up at night to put the dress on, twisting and turning in front of the mirror to see herself at different angles. But it was more than just the dress. She'd begun making modifications. The dress wasn't perfect, and she was obsessed with this idea of making it what it could be. It started with hand-weaving a couple of blue threads into the edges of the dress, but lately she'd turned to accessorizing, turning away from the dress and onto herself. The perfect makeup, the right shade of nail polish, that kind of thing, Jerry explained. I've seen her looking up tattoo places around town. I don't know what to say. Look, you married her, I smiled. In sickness and health, just be there for her, Jerry. I'm all about that, he nodded. But this ain't normal, and I don't know where it's going to stop. Jerry leaned back, dragging his hands across his face. She scares me. I got a couple of updates over the next few days. Susie had changed her hair, her nails, and she was wearing her makeup in an unusual way. Jerry had trouble explaining it. He had managed to dissuade her from getting her face tattooed, but just a day later, he had to stop her again, this time from scarring her own face with a nail clipper. It was getting serious. We texted back and forth, trying to figure out what to do and who to talk to. It was obvious that Susie was having trouble that we couldn't begin to understand. Something had just snapped when she put that dress on, the same dress she'd obsessed over all her life, the one exactly like the one her mother had worn. Which got me thinking, what had really happened to her parents? Not even Jerry knew. It was the one thing that Susie refused to talk about. Then Jerry stopped responding. It was sudden, so I decided to pay him a visit. In all the years that he and Susie had been together, I'd never heard of them having this kind of issue before. I had no idea what to expect. These two were like the baseline picture of what a healthy relationship should look like, and all of a sudden, it had just collapsed. I drove by their home, a row house in a calm residential area. It didn't take long to see that something was wrong. There were neighbors outside and a squad car on the driveway. People were about to scatter back to where they came from, leaving only Jerry and two police officers. They were finishing up as I approached. I caught the glimpse of a conversation ending with Jerry being asked to reconsider something, and that was that. The moment I approached, he gave me a hug. I'd never been hugged like that before, like he was holding on for dear life. He peered inside his home, as if checking for Susie, and told me the story with a hushed tone. Susie had gone off the rails. She'd torn out chunks of her hair and chewed dirt to stain her mouth with the right color. The final straw had been trying to staple her ears to the side of her head, and that's where Jerry had intervened. Things had gone from bad to worse. She says I'm keeping her from perfection, he said. She says I'm holding her back. Susie had attacked him, thrown things, screamed, broken furniture. She had wreaked havoc on their home, completely remorseless. That's why the police were there. The neighbors had called them. But instead of pressing charges, Jerry had dismissed them. He was going to get Susie help personally. He didn't want her to end up in a cell. She needed treatment. And he needed my help to move her. As we stepped inside their home, I could tell it hadn't been a little spat. There was broken glass strewn across the floor, a broken chair, and every painting had been thrown across the room. Susie was sitting on the living room couch in what remained of her torn wedding dress. It had been stained with patches of green, brown and blue. She had large red bald patches on her head, and she'd applied all kinds of makeup seemingly at random. She was slowly dancing with her arms, like she was playing an invisible harp. She said something about her movements being part of her new aesthetic, Jerry explained. She's been like that for the past 20 minutes or so. I took a few steps closer, making sure not to interrupt her movements. They were choppy and artificial, like a buffering video. She had one eye fixed on her hands, and the other eye moving at random. It was impossible to tell if she was paying attention to us. If I hadn't known it was her, there'd be no way to recognize her. Apart from all the things she'd done to herself, she'd also lost a lot of weight. Still, she seemed happy. Maybe even happier than she'd been at the wedding. Jerry moved up behind her and slowly put his hands around her torso. With a little nudging, she got the message and stood up, careful not to miss any arm movements. I moved ahead, making sure there was nothing in the way. It felt like moving a glass figurine. We had no idea what could break her. We managed to get her in the car. Jerry asked me to follow in my own car, but I refused. I didn't want to leave him alone with her, especially not going down a highway. I ended up behind the wheel as Jerry and Susie stayed in the back seat. He had a place in mind, one he'd been in contact with over the past week or so. They were mostly for emergencies, but there'd been nothing but luck keeping this breakdown from causing serious damage. I didn't want to think about what would have happened if she'd been in the kitchen, by the knives. We'd been driving for about 20 minutes when I suddenly heard a snap, then another. Looking over, I saw Susie furiously pulling at her fingers, almost tearing them out of their sockets. Jerry threw himself at her. "No," she cried. "They need to be the same length. They need to be the same." By the time we got to the address Jerry had given me, the back seat was pandemonium. Susie was screeching like an animal, scratching and tearing at Jerry to get away. I saw two men running out of a nearby building to help us. A door opened, and Susie was grabbed. She screamed at them to let her go, to let her fix her fingers, and Jerry screamed back. I barely understood what happened until I was alone in the car, watching Jerry and two men in white uniforms take Susie away. A couple minutes later, I got a text saying I was good to go, and a thank you. Coming home later that night, I took a long look at myself in the mirror. I tried my best to figure out what Susie was obsessing about, but there was no logic to it. Sure, I have my flaws, and she did too, but whatever she was doing wasn't helping. What kind of ideal was she really pursuing? I talked to Jerry just before I went to bed. Susie was in good hands for the time being, and he was at home, sleeping alone for the first time in years. I could tell it was bothering him. "I don't know what she's looking for," he sighed. "It's like she wants something perfect, but she just destroys herself." "Maybe she's got another idea of what's perfect and what isn't," I said. "Maybe, yeah," he agreed. "But some of the stuff she says, it's not just changing your nails or your hair. She says things sometimes when she thinks I don't hear." "Like what?" "Like..." He took a deep breath. I could tell he was in the bathroom. Had he been crying? Like she's wishing for more arms, or to be taller, or to be transparent. Things were quiet for a couple of days after. I reached out to Jerry, but I didn't get a lot back. A quick text every now and then to tell me he was doing okay. Susie was getting the help she needed, but she wasn't improving. At least we'd stopped her from getting worse. I thought about it a lot. Everything had changed the moment she saw that dress. Sure, it had been unique, but what was so special about it? I asked Jerry's permission to ask around and show a few pictures of it. There were also a few cuts that Susie had discarded, which I could use to show off the fabric. I talked to a couple of professionals around town. Most of them didn't have a lot to say or dismissed me entirely. It took me half a day before I found this old woman at a hidden-away private tailor downtown that I could get some answers. They were about to close, but she took some time out of her day to help. She had never seen that cut before, despite having worked with wedding dresses for close to 40 years. It had to be a custom job, but what seemed to vex her the most was the fabric. "It's not charmeuse or georgette," she pondered. "A sateen blend." No. She compared it to a couple of her own fabric samples, but came up with nothing. We were about to give up, when she caught a glimpse of her husband having a cigarette outside. She got an idea and asked my permission to set the fabric on fire. Apparently, that's a way you can get a rough idea about the nature of the textile. Now, this piece of fabric was just a small square, no bigger than the palm of my hand, but she borrowed her husband's lighter, put the square down, and set it on fire. The reaction was immediate. It bulged in the middle as a dozen little branch-like extremities poked out of it. They grew, twisting and turning like a dying snake. The fabric turned from a bright white to a dark blue with a metallic sheen. The branches grew thicker, reaching further and further out, morphing into a petal-like flat surface. By the time the whole square was consumed by fire, it had spread out like a chemical grenade had gone off. At a distance, it was almost pretty, like a blue sunflower. She didn't have the slightest idea what it was supposed to be. The only thing she knew was that she wanted it out of her store, and that she needed to wipe down every surface it had touched with chlorine. I had the image of that fabric twisting and turning under the flames in my head for a couple of days. It was something animalistic about it, like a living, breathing thing. I thought about calling up Jerry to ask for more scraps that I could ask someone else about, maybe a chemist, but I didn't get the opportunity. It was a Thursday around 2 a.m. Jerry called me, breathing heavily into the phone. He'd been running. Apparently there was an issue with Susie. She'd gotten out, and they needed people to help find her. That's all he knew. There was no question about it. Of course I was going to help. I met up with Jerry and made my way out to the mental health facility we'd dropped her off at. We drove past the sign with the Hatchet corporate logo and got stopped at the entrance by an armed guard. Jerry explained that we were there to help with the search, and we were let in. We were to take a detour from the main entrance, though, so I only caught a glimpse of what was happening in there. Whatever Susie had done, it was big news. 2 ambulances, several police vehicles, and about half a dozen unmarked black vehicles. They didn't even have license plates. I think I spotted something splayed out on the asphalt on stretchers, either wounded people or dead. We were guided to the staff parking lot around the back. A handful of other vehicles were parked, and about 24 people surrounding them, mostly volunteer staff. They were handing out search locations, shouting out rules, and telling people who to pair up with and how. But Jerry wasn't having it. In the flashing red and blue lights, I could tell he was having second thoughts. He turned to me and lowered his voice. "I don't think she'd just run into the woods," he said. "I think she's going home." "Then why didn't you stay home?" "Not our home," he said, shaking his head. "The place where she feels most home." There was a secret picnic spot not too far from there. It was where Jerry had proposed. A large field, covered in flowers, with a single 4-bench picnic table that had been overgrown since the early 90s. The place was abandoned, but it was one of Susie's favorite spots in the world. And maybe it was just a hunch, but that's where Jerry felt that she was going. All this talk of beauty might have gotten him thinking about it. We had to go off-road and park on a slope, walking up a hill in the dark. There was a full moon out, but the light was covered in a spotty cloud cover. The sky was passing so fast that you felt like you were moving even when standing still. We made our way through an overgrown trail, past a dense pine forest, and saw the woods open into a clearing. And there she was. I saw her from about 200 feet away, standing on a picnic table, staring at the moon. She'd gotten her dress back, but it was torn and disheveled beyond repair. It had gone from a majestic wedding dress to something that barely covered her knees. It was torn, dirty, frayed and bloody, much like Susie herself. She barely had any hair left. Her eyes were sunken into her head, making her whole face seem smaller. Her chapped lips were drawn back into a permanent half-smile, straining against the shape of her cranium. Her fingers were broken and bruised, and she stood on the tip of her toes, doing a balancing act as she slowly moved her arms around, all without rhythm, rhyme, or reason. This was beyond a pattern. It was surreal, and the image has seared into my head. It still comes to mind when I catch some abstract dance number on TikTok, and when it does, it gives me chills. But that night I didn't just have chills, I was scared. I'd seen a lot of things in my life up until that point, but there was just something unreal about this. It wasn't just madness, it was commitment. Susie knew something we didn't. We approached her slowly. As we got closer, her head turned to us, her eyes darting between me and Jerry. They seemed to move independently of one another. I could see a crack in the corner of her mouth as her involuntary smile twisted into a full-grown grin. "Susie, we gotta go home," Jerry pleaded. "I don't want you getting hurt." She turned her back on him, looking out into the fields beyond. Whatever she saw, there was something far more interesting than what I and Jerry could offer. Still, he didn't give up. He begged her to step down from the table and come to him. He talked about the adventures they'd had and the challenges they'd overcome. And yet, Susie didn't budge. I wasn't really paying attention to what Jerry was saying. I was looking the same way as Susie. What was she really seeing? Was there something there? You know the way a ray of light can catch your eye. A reflection off a piece of jewelry or a watch, and how it can sting your eye out of nowhere. That's how I felt. I followed Susie's eyes, and I saw something. Not in the night sky, but in the tree line on the other side of the glade. Looking at it stung me. It burned. It was uncomfortable, much like a ray of unwanted sun. I recoiled and regained my balance. Jerry stopped in his tracks, looking over at me. I nodded that I was fine. He looked back at Susie, but I tapped him on the shoulder. He turned his attention back to me. "Don't look," I wheezed. "Don't look." But it was impossible not to. Although it burned me, I couldn't help but to look. There was something moving towards us. I couldn't see a shape, because it had none. It was like looking at an uncomfortable feeling and having it bury into your head. I could only look at it in short bursts, but I still couldn't help myself. Susie, on the other hand, was staring at it. She didn't dare close her eyes. As her hand movements relaxed and slowed, I saw her shoulder slump. "They think I'm beautiful," she cried. "They'll make me perfect." "Susie, what are you—" "They can help you too," she sniffled. "We can both go." Then she turned to us, her eyes trembling like a cold dog. She smiled at me with missing teeth, revealing a bloody tongue. Her left eye found me. "You too," she said. You can come too." Jerry not only stopped, but stepped back. He could feel it too. We were being threatened. There was no way Susie could overpower us both. But that wouldn't matter. She wasn't the threat here, and we didn't even understand what was. But looking across the field, I could tell it was coming closer, leaving a trail of flattened grass as it beelined towards us. "Come on, Jerry," she laughed. "Hurry!" He fell backwards, covering his face with his hands. Something in me told me that I ought to do the same, but I didn't. Instead, I turned back to Susie. Whatever was moving out there had reached her, looming over her like a storm cloud. I could feel it. The longer I looked at it, the more complex the sensation. At first it was like a burning pain behind the eyes, leaving a cold and exposed nerve. That nerve tingled with a resonance, painting pictures in my mind like a seismograph. It was happening faster and faster, leaving only fleeting impressions of a being. It had arms longer than bone and skin. It knew words that gave way to thought. It was perfect, beautiful and real, maybe the realest thing I'd ever felt. A transcendent something that had gone past the physical and the immediate, instead surviving as an ideal, as the most beautiful thing you could imagine, fleeting, ever-changing, ever-inviting, and impossible to put into form. This was what Susie had been chasing. She had made herself a mockery in an attempt to create something that couldn't be, and it had recognized her efforts. Looking at Susie for one final time, she screamed with ecstatic joy, and in the blink of an eye, it happened. Her flesh unraveled into a transparent jelly. Her arms bent, snapped, and unfurled into frayed knots, eyes glowing a pure white as her tongue boiled behind crackling teeth. I saw her head twist like a balloon in a storm as her spine left her body. And she laughed. She laughed and cheered to the very end, overjoyed as to come what may. Then she was just gone, dress and all, leaving nothing but a spatter of sizzling stains on the edge of the picnic table. Something turned to me. Even without looking at it, I could feel it looking. Despite everything in me screaming to look away and to deny, there was a part of me that was drawn in by what I'd seen in Susie. Her joy was as pure could get. I wanted to accept it, to explore it. The picture in my mind was growing clearer. and I remember feeling this unearthly sense of peace. I didn't just belong, I was meant to be, and I was beautiful. But luckily Jerry was there. He dragged me down, screaming at me to snap out of it. I hadn't even noticed it, but I was laughing. I had been staring at my hands as if they held some kind of answer. What was I doing? Realizing how close I'd been to losing control, I just hugged my brother and cried. He was inconsolable. We could barely form words as whatever presence we'd felt dissipated, leaving us alone in the dirt, ugly, imperfect, and ourselves. Over the weeks to come, we'd get a bit more context as to what had happened. 2 caretakers had mysteriously disappeared, and a third had been found dead in the break room. The death was described as an accident, but from what eyewitnesses have been telling me, he died in a way that can only be described as a man going through a full-body microwaving. Susie, well, she was just reported missing. What else was there to say? There was no sign of her, and Jerry couldn't very well say that she evaporated. Instead, he was tortured for weeks, asked to keep his chin up, and getting constant reminders that hope was always the last thing to die. They didn't know any better. They didn't know that hope died with a laugh. I think back on that night a lot. I wish it had had a face. I wish I could visualize this singular thing, to put into words what this looked like. But it's impossible. There are no words to describe it. Sometimes in the shower, I try to make up new words for it. They come naturally to me, but I sound completely mad. Nowadays, when I look in the mirror, I don't really see flaws. Not like I used to. I don't see my nose as a little crooked, or my teeth as a little yellow. No, it's bigger than that. It's the sense of being stuck in something static and unchanging, confined. I find myself dreaming of being this cosmic jellyfish, floating formlessly through nothing, barely held together by anything but vague remains of what I was supposed to be. I'm sorry, it's strange. It's really, really strange. And so ungodly beautiful. I've been behind the wheel of a truck for most of my life. I've transported everything, from legitimate goods to drugs to guns. I've been behind the wheel of a truck for most of life, and I thought I saw it all. None of the strange cargo I've ever ferried, however, can compare to working for Dr. Barrett. I found out about Dr. Barrett while having drinks with other truckers. The man was said to be strange, and his jobs were even stranger. One of my colleagues spent a couple weeks hauling pallets of medicine from the middle of the forest to a warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Another would ferry nervous workmen in the company of armed guards from the city center to the middle of the steppe. Dr. Barrett was a strange man with strange jobs, but he paid in cash. When my colleagues told me he was looking for a long-haul driver, I didn't hesitate. They warned me, but I shrugged off those warnings. I needed the money. The instructions were simple. I would meet Barrett in the industrial district where he would be waiting with the cargo already packed in the truck. The drive would take about 2 days, but it was a straight shot through the steppe. Nothing too difficult. Naturally, I was not made privy to what my cargo would be. The less I knew, the better, or so I thought. The cold winter sun had barely risen by the time I arrived at the meeting point. My colleagues had described Barrett as a lean man with messy black hair and a lazy eye. Though there was a truck that matched the specifications of my ride, the scientist was nowhere to be found. Out by the pumps stood 4 identical giants with shaved heads and earpieces and rifles. Behind the plexiglass of the gas station stood a sole nervous clerk. The armed men ignored the anxious teen. They all stared at me with dumb expressions void of all meaning. "You're here." Dr. Barrett walked up behind me, stubbing out his cigarette. He was just as my colleagues had described him, yet he looked a lot more exhausted than I expected him to be. Dark rings around his eyes gave him the look of a raccoon. The disheveled lab coat with coffee stains only amplified the appearance. "You're going to have questions. Don't ask them," he said, ushering me to the truck. "You'll be riding with one of our guards. Don't worry. We're not expecting anyone to interfere. They're mainly here to make sure you won't get any ideas, which you hopefully won't." As we walked, he reached for another smoke. He waved the cigarette towards the 4 armed men and whirled it in the air like a conductor. The obedient symphony split. One of the guards climbed into the cabin of the truck. The other climbed into a dark blue Chargan parked nearby. "Don't try to talk to the guard," Barrett said as we approached the truck. He put the cigarette in his mouth to light it, but then thought better of the pumps. He's not a big conversationalist, not a rule, just a suggestion. Not asking questions is the rule. The trailer on the truck was touched with rust. Its doors seemed to be held together with chewing gum and hope. I had my concerns about the cargo falling out on the road, but Dr. Barrett didn't seem like a man who would appreciate interruption. We'll be driving up front. I have business at the facility we are transferring the cargo to. The guards are just here to ensure the goods get delivered. Hopefully you got your beauty sleep. Tanker's full. Won't be stopping to refuel till the evening, and you'll be driving through the night. There's go pills in the dash if you need them. Cash. Half here, half there, Barrett said, producing a crumpled envelope from his lab coat. Any questions? The envelope was heavier than I expected. I shook my head. Good, he said. Before he got into the driver's seat of the Shagun, he lit up his cigarette. Barrett was right. The bald giant who was riding with me wasn't much of a conversationalist. As I got in the cab, I wished him a good morning and told him my name. He didn't even look at me. The guard just stared on ahead with an expression that suggested little internal monologue. His vague point of focus didn't change until well into the afternoon. Having a rifle in the cab didn't make me comfortable. The strange bald giant not even giving me the courtesy of eye contact made the situation worse. But I got used to it. Once we got out of the city, I turned on some music. Half an hour in, I had forgotten about the guard altogether. I thought that this is what my colleagues warned me about. Mystery cargo in a bad trailer with a potentially unstable armed man. I had never worked under stranger conditions, but the money was worth it. Back then, as the sun was starting to dip down into night, the money seemed worth it. It was still light when I heard the first sounds. Something was shifting around in the trailer. We were in the midst of crawling through some hills. The shuffling sounds persisted, but I just convinced myself that it was the old trailer settling in from the incline. It wasn't until I heard the first gurgle that I turned off the radio. For about a minute I traveled in complete silence. Then the sound returned. A strained, wet sound loud enough to be heard over the engine. I asked the guard if he heard the noise. As expected, he kept his eyes on the road and his mouth shut. My mind started to race with possibilities about what could be inside of the trailer. I had never transported something alive. The size of the paycheck started to tug at my imagination. The strange groans persisted, and their origins grew more numerous. As the creatures in the back of the truck continued to gurgle, I tried to place them within the animal kingdom. Cows, perhaps sheep, could make that sort of sound, but I could imagine no livestock that could make groans so deep and loud. It wasn't until the screaming started that I realized I was not dealing with an animal at all. It came with such force and suddenness that I nearly drove the truck into the ditch. The gurgles from the back of the truck rose to a shrill, unignorable degree. The screams were tortured and rabid and defied all known biology. The horrid sounds coming from the trailer were loud enough to catch the attention of the bald giant sitting next to me. Our eyes met. "Do you hear that?" I asked. If the eyes are a window to the soul, the man's mental palace was condemned decades ago. He held my gaze briefly, without expression, and then he grumbled something into his earpiece. He listened. Past the dark screams from the back of the truck, I could hear a voice buzz in his ear. With a nod and another grunt, the bald giant shifted his gaze back to the world beyond the windshield. When I kept looking back at the trailer and trying to make sense of the screeching, he nudged me with the butt of his rifle. The armed man nodded to the road. That's where my attention was meant to be. The sounds coming from the trailer rose and fell as the drive went on, yet they never truly disappeared. My mind jumped from the flimsy doors of the container to the nature of the screaming cargo to the question of my personal safety. I had slept well the night prior, but the screaming from the back of the truck was so intense that I reached for the pills in the dash. I needed to focus. With the amphetamines in my system, time became immaterial. It could have been 15 minutes. It could have been 3 hours. I drove, laser focused on the Shagun driving in front of me, trying to ignore the horror at my back. I was brought out of my upper-induced trance by another push of the guard's rifle. Off in the darkness of the steppe, there shimmered the faint light of a gas station. Judging by the guards' grunts, we were to stop there. I put up no resistance. Bharat got out of the shagan before I managed to climb out of the cab. With his cigarette, he motioned to the quartet of giants to attend to the truck. "Let them handle the fuel," he said, walking away from the pumps and putting the cigarette in his mouth. It's one of the few things they are proficient at. With my legs weak with horror and my voice trembling with shock, I followed the scientist. I broke the one rule Bharat had clearly stated. I said no questions. His voice was stern, but once he lit his cigarette, he opened up the pack and offered me one. I don't smoke, but the drugs in my system and terror in my soul made me hungry for nicotine. "The less you know, the better," Bharat said, looking off into the endless night of the steppe. "The less you know, the happier you'll be. Take it from me, I know much and I suffer greatly for it." The cigarette didn't soothe my nerves in the slightest. We were standing far enough from the truck for the screams to be muffled, yet even at a distance I could see the trailer rock back and forth with restless movement from the cargo. I demanded to know what I was ferrying across the country. When it became clear to Dr. Bharat that I would not continue my work without answers, he let out a long, tired sigh. "I work for a scientific institution," he said, looking out into the ether, "a research facility that has recently come under certain financial strains. Again, the less you know, the better. But if this institution were to, say, collapse, if the things that were worked on in this institution were to get out into the world..." He shook his head. The quartet of guards stood by the swaying truck, watching us. "We're past the halfway point. By sunrise, we'll stop somewhere safe to sleep. By late afternoon, you'll be a richer man, and you'll never have to think about this drive again." Bharat spared a look to the truck. He scoffed. "I saw the way you looked at the trailer. I concur. It's flimsy. It's flimsy, but what my superiors want, my superiors get. Don't worry, though," he said, when he read the worry on my face. "If any of the cargo gets out, the boys with the guns will take care of it. God knows they're capable of little else." Just as Bharat mentioned our armed escort, they all reached for their earpieces. Something was being said to them. They listened. They listened. And then, with discomforting unison, 3 of the men started to walk towards us. The 4th waited by the trailer, watching it rock from side to side with increasing tenacity. The armed men moving towards us bothered me. They also seemed to bother Bharat, but before he could say anything, his phone rang. "We're past the halfway point," he said into the phone with the slightest hint of deference. "The GH-58s have woken up. I hope they'll go back to resting for the rest of the journey. But please let the people at the new facility know that they might..." "What?" The cigarette fell from Dr. Bharat's lips. "What? You can't be serious." All the respect had faded from his voice. Now he was balancing the edge between fury and fear. "Released. Henry, this is madness. The Institute has kept its secrecy for decades. What could we possibly gain from..." Bharat listened intently to the explanation from his phone. I took a step back. The 3 guards had their rifles raised, and they were far too close for comfort. Seeing their attention focused solely on the disheveled man in the lab coat, I slunk off into the darkness. Bharat continued to argue with the phone as the trio surrounded him. His panic and disbelief rose into shriller and shriller tones until, finally, he was hung up on. That's when Dr. Bharat realized he was surrounded by the guards. That's when he became fully aware of their raised rifles. As he tried to argue with the guards, as he demanded they lower their weapons, I slunk further into the darkness. I knew full well the bald giants weren't conversationalists. I expected them to load him into the car, to maybe rough him up, yet they didn't. As Bharat demanded the guards to leave him be, they raised their hands to their earpieces. They were given the order to shoot. The gunshot sent me diving into the ditch by the road. What followed was a long, strained silence, only accompanied by the far-off, inhuman screams from the trailer. Before the crack of the shots fully settled into the night, a voice came from the gas station. I could not hear what it said. After a couple words, it was cut short by another rapport from the rifle. With the looming threat of death and the chemistry floating around my bloodstream, my aim was singular: survival. As silently as I could, I crawled away from the scene of the murder. Through darkness and rocks and cold earth I crawled, until I was sure the men with rifles couldn't see me. It wasn't until I was certain I was hidden by the dark that I raised my head. 3 tall silhouettes stood at the spot where Barrett had been executed. In the fluorescence of the gas station stood the 4th giant, staring off into the ether. Not far from him lay the unmoving body of a gas station attendant. I could no longer hear the screams of my cargo, yet the trailer still rocked from side to side. We were in the middle of the sticks. I had nowhere to run. I was certain that if the armed men saw me again, I would end up just as Barrett or the gas station attendant did. I kept my head low and watched what the giants would do. After lifting his finger to his earpiece, the armed man by the gas station walked over to the Chagan. He took something out of the car and then went to join the trio in the darkness. Beams of light rendered the silhouettes of the giants whole. With little coordination, the 3 men spread out and started to search the steppe with flashlights. They were nowhere near my hiding spot. That soothed my amped-up heart. What calmed me even further was the realization that the Chagan's taillights were on. The keys were still in the car. Seeing a means of escape, I crept my way towards the gas station. Even though the guard who brought the flashlights was returning back to the pumps, I figured I could distract him and try to escape in the Chagan. The guard, however, did not return to his post. Instead, he made his way to the back of the trailer. He reached for the doors, but hesitated. Whatever was in the back of the truck had grown even more restless. The trailer was bouncing from wheel to wheel, shedding rust. The screaming had reached a new, dark tenor that murmured through the night. The giant raised his hand to his earpiece once more. He nodded. It was a moonless night. The fluorescence of the gas station shined like spotlights on a dimmed stage. They hid nothing. What crawled and leaped out of that truck defied all reason. Blobs of flesh, at least 4 meters tall, with short, stubby limbs, huge eyes, almost cartoon-like in their roundness, took up most of the beast's body mass. The rest was taken up by its horrid, screaming mouth. The things swarmed over themselves to escape the truck, stomping on each other's faces, pushing and shoving and screaming. The faint beams from the trio searching the steppe shifted over to the stampede. The 4th guard had disappeared beneath an avalanche of discolored flesh. The screaming abominations ran off in all the cardinal directions. The things were heavy. As I lay on the ground, I could feel their gallop in the earth. The drumbeat of their stumbling limbs got closer and closer until, to my utter horror, one of the creatures fell into the ditch. It landed flat on its face. It screeched into the cold earth with absolute mania. The lumpy creature was stuck. Feeling like I was balancing on the edge of a heart attack, I wanted nothing more but to crawl as far away as I could from the creature. Yet I quickly realized which way the gas station was. The thought of the guards coming to check on the fallen creature steadied my crawl towards it. I loathed the idea of touching that sickly flesh. Yet the Chagan was in one direction and death lay everywhere else. With bated breath and shut eyes, I crawled over the screaming thing. Its warm flesh nearly sent me into a panic, but I pushed on past the fear. My crawl seemed to have dislodged the creature somehow. By the time I was back on the cold earth, the mass of flesh had risen to its stumpy legs. I crawled away from it as quickly as I could. Behind me, the creature ran in the opposite direction. At first it coughed on the raw earth and stone it had swallowed, but it quickly resumed its terrible scream. By the time I had followed the ditch to the gas station, the screams were mere echoes in the plain of night. When I peeked out of my hole, I was further relieved to see the guard had not gotten up. The beams of the searching trio had gone back to searching the night. They were all moving in unison deeper into the steppe. I took my opportunity and crept towards the Chagan. The gas station clerk was dead, undeniably so. A messy patch of dents stretched across his upper chest, and his eyes were rolled back in his skull. The adrenaline spared me most of the horror of the sight, but when I saw the guard, I could scarcely hold my balance. He was fine. The bald giant was laying on his back, looking up at the blinding fluorescence. He was blinking. He was alive and seemed fairly content. When I saw that the keys were indeed still inside of the Chagan, I considered returning back to Barrett's body and retrieving the rest of my payment. The searching trio was far gone into the steppe, and the guard on his back didn't seem particularly alert. I considered going back to Barrett's body and getting my cash, but then I realized it was the go pills talking. Thanking all that is holy, I climbed into the Chagan and drove off. When I started to back up, the giant that was laying on the floor slowly rose. By the time I was on the main road, he had his hand on the rifle, but he didn't shoot. The gas station quickly became lost in my rearview mirror. Briefly, just as my heart rate started to settle, I saw one of those monstrosities running next to the road. Luckily, my headlights scared it off. Soon enough, it disappeared into the darkness, hopefully never to be seen again. I got rid of the Chagan in the nearest city and retreated back home. There's little that could connect me to the job, and I pray the armed escort lacks the mental capacity to remember me, let alone describe me. Next time I see my colleagues, those that with such warning put me in touch with Dr. Barrett, I'll tell them they were right to warn me. I've driven trucks for most of my life, but no cargo has been as haunting as the one I drove for Dr. Barrett. I knew I had made it home as soon as I merged onto I-24 East. I ran through a minefield of potholes deep and wide, the dilapidated roads scraping and banging against the bottom of my car, and then an abrupt stop as traffic came to an infuriating standstill, an insulting barrier to my way home. I-24, the bane of my existence. It's never clear, even on a Sunday evening. There's constant construction, but never any improvement. I hate that damn highway. They say Nashvillians are a congenial people, but we sure as shit can't drive. The roads are bad enough. But the people driving on those roads are worse. Potholes are somewhat beneficial since they act as speed bumps, yet even those don't have much effect. They drive as if they're in well-armored, souped-up Humvees. I was for sure that's what was impeding my progress this time as well. Bumper to bumper, because some moron had lost control and flipped his car, probably weaving in and out of traffic. Now these days, it's not good enough to be in the slow lane. They push you out of the slow lane as if you were cramming up the fast lane. Or maybe it was a crotch rocket splashed all over the side of a big rig because some dumb punk tried to squeeze in between two 18-wheelers. I imagined all kinds of scenarios, every one of them angering me to no end. I was tired and irritable, a 10-hour drive and too many energy drinks. I was full of piss and caffeine, not at all in the mood to sit in traffic whiffing exhaust and burnt rubber. I was stuck behind an SUV with a sticker of Jesus' head on one side of the window and Our Lady of Guadalupe on the other. Somewhere trapped in this sea of vehicles were at least 3 screeching banshees, teenage-owned cars equipped with specialty pipes made to backfire, crackle and explode. My GPS showed a bold red line from the bottom to the top of the screen, less than 20 miles from home, but more than an hour to go. There was a competition between the 3 for our entertainment to see who could make their exhaust more obnoxious. More than 30 minutes and I was bound to lose my mind. The line began to move, the swell inched forward. It was enough space for the car behind me to pull around on the shoulder of the road and jump in front of me. It was an asinine move that gave him hardly any more advantage than he already had. I felt blood rush to my head. I grinded my teeth and clinched the steering wheel as if to crush it with my bare hands. "You stupid motherfucker!" I yelled, and not just once, but over and over again, banging my fists against the steering wheel as I did so. Pipes backfired, horns honked, brakes squealed, drivers cussed. Mayhem enveloped the highway. The GPS now mockingly flashed 2 more hours until I would get home. Time was going backwards, and I wasn't making any headway. The car in front of me darted into the left lane. Appreciative of the driver's foray into futility, I quickly resumed my position behind the SUV. Jesus looked into heaven, oblivious to the world around, but Mary looked frustrated, forced to stare down, to look at the fullness of insanity. Traffic began to roll forward. My car dipped forward as it fell into yet another pothole. I cringed at the sound of the bottom of my car scraping against the road. "Fuck you!" I yelled. I heard a muffled "fuck you" in another car beside me and a childish chuckle. A young boy was laughing into his hands. His mother reached back and slapped him across the head. "Roll up that window," she demanded as she gave me a chiding glance. Mary didn't seem too pleased with me either. I told myself I needed to relax. There was nothing I could do, but even the thought of that angered me. 30 minutes ticked away with no movement at all. I wanted to get out of the car to stretch my legs and possibly see what was happening. I opened the door and unfastened my seatbelt. The smell of sulfur immediately stung my nose and throat. In the distance, a plume of yellow smoke began to rise up into the air. I walked away from the car to the shoulder of the road. I could hear a ruckus of people screaming and cars crashing. The plume of smoke grew thicker and fanned out into a myriad of tendrils across the expanse of the sky. It shot beyond where I was standing and stood still in the air for a moment, and then there was an explosion. Yellow dust slowly descended to the highway. I started to make my way back to the car, but I had waited too long. The dust had nearly reached the ground. I didn't have any time to get to the shelter and safety of my car. No need, though. The dust was falling only on the highway. I was safe on the shoulder of the road, but to be even more cautious, I moved up onto the hill near the barrier. The dust didn't settle on the exterior of the cars, but passed right on through and into the ground except for when it encountered people. When it landed on people, it was immediately absorbed, so much so that it was visible as an aura around each person. There was the dust, and then a void around the person that was absorbing the dust. Something maddening was in the dust, for when it was absorbed, people lost their minds. They would shake their heads violently and slobber at the mouth. Every passing glance was an occasion for a fight. Drivers used their vehicles as weapons. Cars were banging into the backs of other cars. A driver further down pulled onto the shoulder of the road and accelerated to a high speed, then slightly pulled the car back towards the road, knocking off mirrors and scraping exteriors until finally a flatbed truck pulled out in front of it. The car smashed into the side of the trailer. The roof partially peeled back, and there was a splatter of blood that shot out of the side of the car. The tail end lifted into the air, swung to the right, and then slammed to the ground. If what existed before was gridlock, then this was the absolute cessation of all mechanical motion. Every car was either locked in place by another car or totaled by the confluence of high velocity. Whatever the case, none escaped. Now the madness spilled out of the cars. There was a general melee falling like dominoes down the highway. Men and women beating each other, kicking and biting, doing whatever they needed to do to cause their fellow human beings to suffer. I saw the boy who earlier had mimicked me. His mother laid on her back, unconscious, while her son repeatedly kicked her in the head. The father was too busy pounding another man's head into the street. A horrible thought popped into my head. I wondered if the father wasn't preoccupied with attempted homicide. Would he stop his son or help him? Maybe it was he that knocked her out in the first place. His son was just mopping up. "Hey, you piece of shit!" A burly man, far bigger than me, had spotted me up on the embankment. He was wearing his anger in every aspect of his mannerisms. His fists were balled up and arms swinging erratically. He was breathing fast and hard, face red, stomping up towards me like a bull after a matador. Yet, as soon as he stepped off the road and into the grass, everything about him changed. He loosened up his fists and relaxed. He had a bewildered look on his face and was genuinely confused about where he was at. He looked behind him and was overwhelmed with shock. "What's going on?" he asked as he ran up to me. "I don't know. Everyone has gone crazy. Look at that kid. I've got to stop him." I grabbed him by the arm. "I don't think you should go back in there. Maybe we can lure him out." There was another explosion in the sky as I carefully approached the road, gauging the boundary between war and peace. "Hey, you little shit. Look at me, you filthy little turd." The child ignored me, ever focused on kicking his mom. I gathered a handful of pebbles and started throwing them. Most of my early attempts were wide left and didn't get much better from there. It had been a while since I'd thrown anything, and my new buddy grew impatient with my lack of athleticism. He stepped up beside me and in the most perfect form launched a pebble that hit the young boy square in the jaw. The boy stumbled a bit, but then without hesitation ran towards us. His eyes were a dark yellow with small black pupils. He made a beastly growl as he made his way across the road and through the carnage. We backed away to give him plenty of room to run through. The boy barreled through the invisible field, stumbling to his knees as he came off the road. He began bawling, putting his hands to his temples. My head hurts," he cried out. "Come here, son. What's your dad's name?" "Where's Mummy?" "Dead. And you've been kicking the shit out of her for 30 minutes. "She's at home. What's your dad's name?" "Richard, my head, it hurts so bad." My partner approached me. "Which one is he? You can't throw worth a shit." "I think it's the guy in the red t-shirt." Take care of the boy. I'll get his dad. He stuck out his hand. My name's Tom. I shook his hand. Dave. He looked appreciative, as if I had saved his life. All I had done was accidentally lured him out of the water like a worm on a hook. I guess sometimes, in rare circumstances, being a spineless worm is enough to be a hero. Yet, I felt guilty because I believe he assumed that what I had tried to do for the kid I had done for him. Some things are best left unexplained. I picked up the boy and carried him to the barrier. Tom was efficient. Each and every pebble he threw hit its mark, but the boy's father was determined to finish off he poor fellow he was on top of, his fists bloody and torn from overuse. Finally, Tom hurled a larger rock, smacking the man in the side of the head. "Come on, Richard. Come get you some." "That's right," Tom said as he got into a boxer's stance. Tom had snagged him, the bait taken. Richard got up and sprinted toward the side of the road, hungry for another fight. The same as before, as soon as Richard got off the road, he fell into a stupor, grabbed his head and fell to the ground. He groaned and rolled over to his stomach. "My head. It's about to explode. Where's Carol? Brett?" I saw Tom put his arms around his shoulder and whisper in his ear. Richard broke down and wept. The boy had not noticed his father. He was in pain, complaining that there was a loud ringing in his ears. I felt everyone was poisoned and that the longer they were in, the more likely they were to die. Richard stood up and stared into the chaos. He started to walk back towards the road, but Tom grabbed him. A struggle ensued and Tom slammed Richard to the ground. "Help, Dave, I need help!" I left the boy and ran down and sat on Richard's legs. Tom was laying across his chest and squeezing Richard in a headlock, trying to talk sense into him. "You can't go back out there. You'll lose it." "I can't leave her out there. It's not right." "We'll get her later when all this clears." "When what clears? What is it? What in the hell is it?" What was what? That was a good question. The one column had now split into two columns. The explosions became more frequent. The madness expanded. Richard eventually calmed down. He knew that Tom was correct, that going back out there was a bad idea. The boy was reunited with his father. Nothing was said of his mother. We walked our way up the highway, hugging the barrier, until it ended, making our way closer to the source. Our numbers grew as time passed, for often someone would see us, charge, and then break through the insanity. After a short rest, and a tentative explanation, we would resume our voyage. The fighting further up the highway was now sluggish. People had worn themselves out, but were still unwilling to stop. Their efforts were pitiful, but their spite was far from weakening. Some were on their knees, slapping at their opponents. Others were simply lying on their backs, verbally harassing whoever they saw. A good deal of them were deceased. Finally, after an hour of walking, we made it to the source. In the middle of the highway was a large sinkhole, extending across the width of the road. Deep from within the hole, a wide column of yellow smoke, churning like a tornado, rose high into the sky. Lightning and fire shot out from the sides. The rumble of thunder shook the ground, and there was a continuous loud shrill piercing the air. The column forked and became two near the top, and folded over and extended down the highway, exploding ever so often and dousing the highway below. Oddly, the width of the column equaled exactly the width of the eastbound lanes. The ground and cars near the perimeter of the hole were on fire. On the other side of the column and in the westbound lane were a convoy of black sedans, black vans, and black semi-trucks. There was a command center with trailers and tents set up to the side of the highway where we were headed. The fire trucks and the police cars were kept at bay. The convoy was blocking their path and not letting them through. "I don't feel too comfortable staying on this course," Tom confided in me. "I don't think they are there to help us." I agreed. Tom and I, along with Richard and Brett, made a detour and went perpendicular to the highway and walked through an adjacent field. None of the others followed. We watched from a distance as they were rounded up and herded into one of several trailers. After some time, we separated and went our own ways. It was a long walk home, but one I appreciated. I felt sure that the feds were waiting at my house, and I wasn't in any hurry to be apprehended and liquidated. When I got close to home, I snuck around to my neighbor's yard across the street and watched for a while. When I was sure no one was waiting on me or spying outside my house, I made my way to the front door. I put the key in and was waiting for someone to grab me. Nothing. I turned the key and went inside. Safe. The house was empty. I didn't even undress. I stumbled to my bed and immediately fell asleep. The next day, Metro Police called and said that they had my car. They explained that it was probably totaled and best to call my insurance. Months passed and no one has harassed me. No one has accosted me and threw me in a room and interrogated me for hours. I suspect they're watching me, though. They're seeing what happens, waiting in the shadows, biding their time. Are there any lingering effects? How did he escape the mayhem? Why isn't he affected? Just pure luck, boys. Stepping away at exactly the right time. This worm wiggled and squirmed and accidentally survived. The news said it was a massive gas leak and that it hindered visibility for miles. This resulted in a 10-mile pileup. I guess the violent behavior was due to frustration. They didn't speak much to that. After all, I-24 is nothing but potholes and assholes. That's enough to drive anyone mad, and not really news at all. The frigid evening air bites at my skin as I throw my car door closed. I feel like I'm lost as I step out into the driveway. The manor looms against the orange sky, casting a fiendish shadow over me. I don't let it scare me away. I can't let it. Its windows glow a hazy yellow and look down on me like watchful eyes. There is an unignorable feeling building in my gut that I do not belong here. I can scarcely believe the manor itself belongs here. It looks as though it has been ripped from the past, from a time of lords and balls and cotillion, something I could only hope to experience through my television screen in one of those soapy period dramas. Its walls seem to stretch impossibly high, and its steep roof meets at multiple jagged peaks. The structure is ordered chaos with multiple bays protruding at odd angles, but there is an audacious beauty to the disorder of the manor. My heels clack against the pavement as I step up to the double-wide front doors, and as if they've sensed my presence, they pull open with a low, croaking sound. I have the unshakable feeling that this is my last chance to turn around and run away. But what good would that do? It doesn't matter if danger lurks inside the manor. If I try to flee, there may be nothing left to return to, only ashes of what I've strained to hold together for the past 2 years. That was the warning, wasn't it? That's what's at stake. A figure steps out of the door. Against the backlight of the manor's interior, I can't make out a face, but as I strain my eyes and step closer, I realize it's wasted effort. The figure in the doorway is wearing a mask that in and of itself is featureless. A rounded black plate over the face. He, I believe it's a man, beckons me to follow him inside with a wave of his arms. I swallow my unease and follow after my faceless greeter. He leads me down a wide hallway. The interior of the manor gives the impression that no one lives here. There are no furnishings, and the walls are undecorated, blank slates save for the sconces that light our way. I wipe the sweat from my palms against my dress, fearing what kind of trap I've just wandered into. Without a word, my guide shows me to a door at the end of the hall and steps aside. He wants me to go inside. I try to peek around the edges of his mask as I approach the door, trying to catch a glimpse of what kind of expression he might be making under there, but the edges press neatly against his skin and leave me nothing to see. I can't help but wonder if there's even a face to be seen beneath the mask. My hand grips the brass doorknob and twists, the door coming open with a click. I step through into a grand dining hall. It's in stark contrast to the rest of the house, with furnishing covering every inch of the space. A large, rectangular table stretches across the center of the room, with a crystal chandelier hanging above its center. A towering hutch is sprawled across one wall, displaying a neat arrangement of fine porcelain. And though flames crackle in the fireplace at the far corner of the room, the dining hall still feels cold. There are 4 seats around the table, 1 on each side. 2 of them are already filled. At the far head of the table is a kid that can't be any older than 19. He's pale, with dark circles under eyes that dart back and forth across the room nervously. His lips are pressed tightly together, and I can see his jaw clenching. I can't blame him for being anxious. There's been a whirlpool in my stomach from the moment I got that letter in the mail. Sitting to the left of the kid is a tall, thin man dressed in a suit that doesn't quite fit. It juxtaposes the kid's baggy hoodie, and I assume this man must have felt the same impulse to dress for this odd occasion that I had. The thin man has a narrow but kind face. Boxy glasses rest on top of his hooked nose. His hair rings around only the sides of his head, and the bald skin on top shimmers beneath the chandelier. They both acknowledge me with a glance as I step into the room. I nod my head curtly in return and cross to the table, running my hand along the lace tablecloth as I find my seat. It isn't marked with a name card. That would be against the rules. Instead, a pack of Marlboros rests on top of the plate, and I blush, knowing they're meant for me. I set my purse down on the table beside me and take my seat across from the thin man, with the kid to my right. We wait in silence for the last empty seat at the end of the table to be filled. It's several agonizing minutes before another man barges through the door to the dining hall. He's dressed casually with suspenders that frame his bulging gut. His shoulders are broad, arms thick and hairy below his rolled-up sleeves. He eyes each one of us in the room with fire before taking his seat. He scoffs at the item on his plate. I'd seen it myself as I walked by earlier, and I'm sure the other two in the room had as well. A golden badge with red accents for the chief of the Northgate Fire Department. It was my first clue as to the identity of one of the other people in the room, and a vital one. None of us seem to know what to do as we sit around the table. I look around at my mysterious companions. One of them knows my secret, the ugliest part of me that has threatened to tear me apart from the inside for 2 years. Tonight, that threat may come to fruition. My eyes are on the chief. Why would he be here? Is he the one, or is it just to make me scared? It's the chief who finally dares to break the silence. I take it we all got a letter? All but one, I should think. That's the thin man. His voice is mousy, like he had to force the air out of his lungs. 3 days ago, I got a letter in the mail. There was no return address, no indication of who or where it came from. Inside was a single slip of paper. It read, "I know what you did. I'm going to tell the world unless you play my game." Below, there was an address for the manor, a date, and a time for the dinner party. On the back, a set of instructions. How to play. Abide by the rules and guess which dinner party attendee knows your secret. Guess correctly and you win. Your secret will be safe. Guess incorrectly and be punished, but whose will be the worst? You only get one guess. Make it count. Rules. 1. You may not tell anyone at the table your name. 2. You may not leave the table until someone has been accused. 3. An accusation must be made by the end of our dinner party. 4. The accusation must be unanimous. I don't even know what I'm doing here, the chief barks. I haven't done anything. There's something in his voice. It's defensive. He's lying. He has done something and he's testing the room, seeing if anyone will challenge him. My heart slows down just a bit. The chief may just be another player in this game after all, or he's doing a good job acting the part. Either way, his presence here wipes away any lingering doubts that this whole thing is some kind of hoax. Someone in this room definitely knows what I did, and they've planted the chief here to make me understand that. How do we start? I ask, but 2 of the other 3 people in the room won't know how to answer, and the third would never say. As expected, the others all stay silent. The door is thrown open a moment later, causing the thin man to jump. 2 masked servants enter the room, each carrying a stainless steel platter in one arm. A bowl of steaming hot soup is placed in front of each of us. The broth smells richly of beef. I feel my throat tighten. The servants vanish back out the door, and silence looms again. I bite down on my lip as I watch the room. The thin man takes up a spoon and dips it into the soup. Before he can lift it to his mouth, the chief shoots up from his chair. "It's you," he declares. The thin man gapes and drops his spoon. It clatters against the bowl and sends up a splash of broth that speckles the white lace tablecloth. The chief must have had the same thought as me. Someone in this room brought us all here to punish us. They've pitted us against each other, and we don't know how far they're willing to take things. They don't want us to trust anything, including the food. The first person to take a bite would be taking a risk, unless they already knew it was safe. "What did I do?" the thin man asks. "That soup's poison for all we know," says the chief, "but you dove right in." I didn't think, the thin man stammers. Calm down, I say to the chief. We only get one guess, remember? We need to be sure. The chief grunts and sits back down. None of us touch the soup, the thin man delicately pushing it away from himself. There's an angle to this game. For now, I have to assume everyone at the table has a secret like mine. Uncovering those secrets is the key to winning the game, but if the others are anything like myself, they won't be willing to reveal their own secrets. If the orchestrator of this game put the chief here to deter me from sharing mine, he likely took similar measures with the others. I need to get them talking, make them slip up, reveal too much. What was on your plate when you came in? I asked the thin man. Just these glasses, he says, pushing them up his nose. Jesus, and you put them on? The chief balks. I wonder at the meaning behind the glasses. The pack of cigarettes left on my plate seemed meant to taunt me. Was it the same for the others? And you? I asked the kid. He holds up a cell phone, the screen shattered into a glass web. The thin man's eyes flick toward the kid, then back away, almost like he's afraid to look at him. Is there a connection there? I had this pack of cigarettes on mine, I say. So, what am I supposed to call you then? The chief complains. Smokey? I don't understand why we can't just say our names. Because that would be too easy, the thin man says. It begs the question why the orchestrator barred us from sharing our names. What would our names reveal to one another? Too easy to do what? The chief questions. To win, I suppose, says the thin man. What's stopping me from telling everyone here my name? Says the chief. It's against the rules. Who cares about the rules? Then do it, I test him. Tell us your name. The chief's eyes fix on mine. He's thinking exactly what I'm thinking. None of us know for sure what will happen if we break a rule. At the very least, we'd lose the game. Our secrets would be revealed, but there's that line in the letter, guess incorrectly and be punished. But whose will be the worst? Whose will be the worst? There's an undeniably sinister note to the line, as if the punishment for failure is far worse than simply having our secrets revealed. There's something else in store for the losers of the game, but what? Breaking a rule would be risking finding out, and it's clear that none of us are willing to tread that ground. What's gonna happen? The chief chuckles, but there's a nervous undertone to it. No offense, but I'm pretty sure if it came down to it, I could take all of you on. He's probably right. I know I don't stand a chance in a fight against the chief, and it's hard to picture the thin man or the kid getting the upper hand on him, but whoever orchestrated this game was confident. They wouldn't have invited a man like the chief without a plan to keep him in line. He knows it too. He eyes us like sharks circling the water, and he doesn't dare give us a drop of blood. Forget it, he grumbles. He stands up from his seat and crosses to a beverage cart in the corner of the room, taking a bottle of bourbon and popping the cap off. He gulps it down straight from the bottle and lets out a satisfied "ah" when he's done. Hang on, the thin man protests. How do we know it's not you now? If the food could be poisoned, so could the drink. Then so be it, says the chief before taking another swig, but I'm not getting through tonight without a drink. He plops back down in his seat, and I make a mental note about the way he's coddling that bottle. I look to my right and notice the kid staring at him too, his eyes wide, almost fearful. Are you okay? I ask. The kid blinks like I've pulled him out of a trance. He looks at me and nods almost imperceptibly. No exit, the thin man whispers. What was that? I ask. No exit, he repeats, louder this time. Jean-Paul Sartre. It's a play about 3 people locked in a room together, except the room is in hell. Hell is other people. Sounds awfully familiar, the chief chimes in. Do you think whoever brought us here was trying to replicate the play? I ask the thin man. It must be him then, says the chief. I've never heard of this stupid play. He's the only one going on about it. Just because I'm more well-read than this oaf does not mean I set this all up, the thin man retaliates. What did you call me? The kid stifles laughter. It's the first time I've seen him look something other than petrified. Something funny, the chief growls, and the kid retreats further into his chair, shaking his head. In the play, the thin man continues, the characters confess their crimes to one another. Maybe we're supposed to do the same. You first, the chief scoffs. The thin man's mouth falls open, but he can't summon any words. He drops his chin, ashamed of himself. "That's what I thought," says the chief. He takes another swig of bourbon. He's gone through about a third of the bottle already. "Anybody else want to give it a go?" Though it's not against the rules, no one wants to be the first to show their hand, share their secret. The room falls back into silence, and as if on cue, the masked servants come through the door once again with fresh platters. They take away our untouched appetizers and place unique plates down in front of each of us. When they lift the lid off my plate, I see a blackened mass of food. It's all been burnt to a crisp. Another taunt. Two pungent smells waft toward me from either side, competing for dominance. From the left, the chief's food smells as though it's been soaked through in liquor. From the right, the kid's food smells raw and rotten. I choke down a gag. We all eye the thin man. His plate is empty. "What's that about?" the chief questions. "I don't know," the thin man insists. "We all get this fucked up food and you get nothing. It's suspicious if you ask me. Will you stop accusing me over every little thing?" Hearing these two at each other's throats again makes my mouth water for a cigarette. I find my hand subconsciously reaching for the pack of Marlboros before I pull it away. Another look at my charred plate wipes the craving from my mind. Both the place markers and the meals had been meant to remind us that someone in the room knows our secrets, but that also means I can use them to my advantage, use them as clues. A fire chief with a penchant for the drink, a broken cell phone and rotten meat, a pair of glasses and an empty plate. The thin man's clues are so nondescript, it's hard to gather any meaning from them. My suspicion shifts toward him, but I'm not ready to make any final accusations yet. I ponder over the other clues as well. The chief has already given a clear enough image of himself even without the second clue. There's nothing new to gain there, so I focus on the kid. I try to piece together the meaning behind his two clues, but I can't think of a connection. The rotten meat on his plate makes me think whatever secret he's keeping is a gruesome one. It would explain the fear written in bold across his face. He may have the most to lose tonight. I feel sorry for him, but I'm also afraid of him. The chief looks down at my plate, notes the pack untouched of cigarettes beside it. "Feeling like you need a puff yet?" My heart pangs, fearing he's figured me out. "Keep that habit up, and your lungs will be looking like that plate of yours." The irony as he takes another swig from his bottle. "I already quit," I say, 2 years ago. There's something judgmental in the chief's tone that makes me explode. "Do you have a problem?" Let's just say I'm not all that impressed with my current company. Some of his words are beginning to slur together. "Because you're such a class act," I argue. The chief slams a fist down on the table, sending a shockwave across it that rattles all of our plates. "I save lives for a living. I'm a goddamn hero. What do you do?" A laugh escapes my chest. "Hero? You wouldn't be here if that was the case." "Think you know something?" he accuses. "You think I put this together?" I say. "You're barking up the wrong tree." The chief's face is red, and not just because of the alcohol. He takes another drink, and it spills down his chin. He's disgusting. "You're so quick to make accusations," says the thin man. "How do we know it's not you?" "I'm the only one making the effort to figure this thing out." "You really think that's true?" I ask. "It's a good cover," the thin man theorizes. "You're taking the attention off yourself and putting it on everyone else. Am I not the center of attention right now?" "You're so full of yourself," I groan. "Watch it," the chief warns. "Only someone so full of themselves would create a game like this," the thin man mutters. "Or someone so insecure," the chief presses back. "We're getting nowhere with this bickering. The clock is running down." Through two large windows on the wall behind the kid, I can see the last glimmers of sunlight fading over the horizon. We only have until the end of the meal to make our accusation, and none of us are on the same page. Is it possible the chief is trying to derail us? Keep us distracted with senseless arguing until time runs out? It feels like I'm giving him too much credit. "You seem to think you know a lot about me," the chief says to the thin man. "What else do you know, huh?" "I only know what you've shown me tonight." "You sure about that?" the chief presses. "You sure you don't know any supposed secrets about me?" I don't." The chief shoots up from his chair and staggers on tipsy legs. "What are we waiting for? It's him! It's gotta be! Let's make the accusation and get out of here. Are you with me, kid?" The kid's mouth falls open, but the only sound that comes out is a weak string of ums and ers. His eyes dart wildly around the room. For a moment, I see them connect with the thin man's. He meets the kid's gaze for only a second before averting his eyes. It's the second time I've caught him doing that. There's something in the thin man's eyes when he looks at the kid, something that looks like guilt. And a guilty man couldn't be the orchestrator. Guilt implies secrets. "How do you two know each other?" I ask the thin man, cutting through the mounting tension in the room. "We don't know each other." "Then why do you keep looking at him like that?" A sweat breaks out on the thin man's forehead. "I've never met him before." "Bullshit," says the chief. "You're lying," I follow up. I look at the kid. "I'll ask you the same question. How do you two know each other?" The possibility dawns on me that more than one of the dinner guests has orchestrated this game. The thin man and the kid could be in league with each other. The game may have been rigged from the start. It makes sense. If the goal was to punish us for our secrets, why let us win? I wait for a response. The chief is less patient than me. "Say something!" The kid's face is paralyzed in fear. "You've been awfully quiet tonight, kid," says the chief. "Answer the question now." He's right. I realize now that I haven't heard the kid speak a single word since I Saturday down. The smell of his rotting meat rakes through my nostrils, threatening to make me sick. What does it mean? The dining hall door is thrust open again. The servants have returned, hoisting fresh platters over their heads. It's time for the dessert course. "We're running out of time." "Hey," the chief shouts, rounding unsteadily on one of the servants. "Get out of here with that. I'm sick of this bullshit." The chief throws himself at the servant, but he bounces off as if the masked man is made of stone. He tumbles pitifully to the floor. The kid doesn't hold back his laughter this time. His eyes are wide with amusement, and his cackle is the loudest he's been all night. It's directed at the chief, but I feel it drilling into myself in equal measure. The servants place down our final course and lift the lids off all 4 plates simultaneously for the big reveal. A single fortune cookie rests on each of our plates. None of the others seem to notice. The kid is too busy laughing at the chief rolling around drunkenly on the floor, and the thin man looks petrified as he gazes up at the kid. I reach for my cookie and break it open. I unfold the slip of paper inside and read, "Reckless burning, felony, 6 years." My sentence. What will happen to me if my secret ever gets out? I feel the muscles in my throat grow tight and struggle for air. The cookies are the final clue, our last chance to win the game. While he's still on the floor, I race over to the chief's plate and crack open his fortune cookie. "What do you think you're doing, you bitch?" he squeals. I read his fortune and my heart skips a beat. Reckless driving, hit and run, vehicular homicide, 20 years. Some hero. "Put that down," the chief hollers. He's finally gotten himself to his feet. "I didn't give you permission to read that." The chief grabs my arm and rips the fortune out of my fingers, reading it for himself. His face goes pale. The kid hasn't stopped laughing at him. Is he laughing at the chief, or is he laughing at all of us? I wrench my arm free from the chief's grasp and stare daggers at the thin man. "What does yours say?" I demand. He breaks away the cookie and reads his own fortune. His face falls, and he hands me the slip of paper willingly. "Coward, eternal guilt." It's different from mine and the chief's, but no less damning. I look up at the kid. "I'm ready to make an accusation," I announce. The corners of the kid's lips tick upward in a smile. "Figured it out?" There's an unsettling quality to the kid's voice. It's raspy and feels breathless, like the words simply float out of his mouth with no force behind them. There's not a doubt in my mind any longer that he's the one who brought us all here. He breaks open his own cookie and presents his fortune to the rest of us. There's nothing on the paper but an image of a skull and crossbones. "It's you." "But how do you know?" the chief asks. There was no one around. "How do you know what I did?" The kid's smile stretches into a full rictus. "It was an accident." The chief cries in a weak attempt at defending himself. "There was a fire. I was in a hurry." "A fire?" I ask, realization slapping me across the cheek. How many years ago was the accident? 2 years, says the chief. My heart pounds in my chest. And you? I ask the thin man. How many years have you been keeping your secret? 2, he says. Of course. We weren't summoned here at random. How could I not see that sooner? We were brought here to be punished, but not individually. We were being punished for the same crime, by the victim. It all started with you, Ms. Whitaker, says the kid. My name? It feels jarring to hear it said aloud in this room. Taboo. How many packs a day did you used to smoke? The kid wonders. 1, 2. More than you're willing to admit, that's for sure. And what did you do when you'd smoked those cigarettes down to a nub? You flicked them aside. Until one evening, in the fall, a pile of leaves caught fire and spread fast. It was you, the chief realizes. You started the fire that night. It was your fault. I wouldn't be so quick to throw blame around, Chief Chambers, says the kid. You were on call that night, but where were you? At the bar, staring down the bottom of a bottle. When that call came in, you didn't want to get in trouble, so you didn't mention the fact that you'd been drinking. You just got behind the wheel of your car and drove off. You were so drunk, you hardly even registered the person standing in the road in front of you. You only realized when you felt them crumple beneath your tires. But did you stop? Answer me, Chief. I had to get to the fire before it spread any further, Chambers says meekly. No excuses, the kid roars. Did you stop? No, of course not. The kid smiles unpleasantly. But someone did. Right, Mr. Bennett. The thin man recoils at the sound of his name. As the kid talks, I notice his form begin to change. The skin on his face begins to crack and peel away like aged leather, curling up in sickening ribbons. I realize then that the kid isn't merely someone who has been affected by this tragedy. He's not doing this on someone else's behalf. He's the one. You found me broken on the road, says the kid. You stumbled out of your car and staggered over to me. I was barely clinging to life. And what did you do? Nothing. For 20 minutes you sat there like an idiot while I was dying. I was in shock. So was I. And by the time you called the police, it was too late. I was already dead. What do you mean? Chambers asks. The urge to run builds in my gut as I recognize what's happening. Whatever the kid is, he's not human anymore. The human version of him died on that road 2 years ago. This is what's left. His anger has brought him back in this twisted form to take revenge. I mean that you killed me, Chief. The kid stands and licks his lips. His tongue is as dry and cracked as the rest of his skin, and it peels away another layer from his lips. Blood bubbles up in place of the missing skin. He steps up onto the table and walks slowly across it. I can hear the wood groaning beneath his weight, despite the fact he's thin as a twig. Each step toward Chambers is filled with purpose. I wonder why Chambers isn't running. Is he too scared or too drunk? Your crime was the greatest. It only makes sense that I start with you. The kid bends down over Chambers and places a hand on top of his head. For a moment, it looks like nothing's happening, but then I notice the skin flaking up around the kid's knuckles as he squeezes. Pressure builds on Chambers' skull. He bellows hauntingly as one eye bulges out of place. A blood-red tear streaks down his face just before his head pops like a water balloon. Viscera spray across my dress. I feel warm, wet clumps sticking to my skin, but I don't make a sound. I wonder which of us is going to be next, me or Bennett. The kid licks Chambers' blood off his fingers with his cracked tongue. The blood almost seems to soak into it, revitalizing it. The kid turns around and makes his choice. His eyes fall on Bennett. No, please, Bennett cries. I'm sorry. His words are pointless. They won't sway the kid. He hops down from the table and steps up to Bennett. The kid's fingers curl around Bennett's throat. I stay just long enough to see Bennett's skin begin to unfurl in the same way as the kid's before I make a run for it. I charge out of the room, surprised to find the door isn't locked. Bennett's screams are agonizing. I can't help but picture him as his skin sloughs off in painful strips. I can't slow down, or the same will happen to me. I run straight down the wide, empty hall for the front door. My heart leaps when I find it unlocked as well. I stagger over to my car and search frantically for my keys. Why can't I find them? My purse. I had a purse. I left it inside. I turn and see the kid silhouetted in the doorframe at the front of the manor. I lose all will to keep fighting and try to come to terms with my fate as he slowly walks over to me. I slide down to my knees, feeling the prickle of the asphalt against my skin. The kid crouches down in front of me, and I prepare myself for the worst pain I think I'll ever experience. I hope at least it will be quick. The kid holds out my palm and drops my car keys into them. My breath hitches as I look up at him. He's already walking away. "Why?" I choke out. He turns to face me one last time. "You were the only one that tried to change." Then he walked back up the steps to the manor and closed the door behind him, taking all our secrets with him. Sometimes reality breaks open just enough to let in some terrible things that lurk beyond the light provided by this plane of existence. Things that spend eternity hunting and rutting in the darkness beyond, suddenly free to creep into the sunshine and normality of the sane world we take for granted. Like a violent rape, they tear their way into our dimension to do dark and bloody deeds under the light of our sun. I'd like to tell you how I know that. I'd also like to tell you how the knowledge of such things has been passed down through my familial DNA, like some strange disease, to be activated randomly like some recessive gene at some later point in time, bringing terrible symptoms with it. I first reckoned with what I call the awareness curse that plagues my family like a hidden and lurking prion disease as a young boy, when that black and ancient alter universe gave screaming birth to one of its incomprehensible horrors. My grandfather served in the Navy during the war in Korea. He never talked about it. I asked him once when I was little what it was like. He made me promise to never join the military and go to war. He told me he didn't like talking about it and told me that war is terrible and unnecessary. I really took him seriously as I respected him so very much. He was an honorable man. He acted as my stand-in father while my biological father lived his best life somewhere with drugs and partying. He never drank, as alcoholism nearly killed him decades prior. When he came home from the war, he struggled to get back to civilian life. He turned to drink as a coping mechanism. It nearly ended his life in a single vehicle crash. It almost ended his marriage too. He had long since promised my grandmother that he'd never drink again. He had a limp from the accident that acted as a daily reminder of the dangers of drinking. My mother also abandoned me. She was still a teenager when I was born. Feeling robbed of her high school years, she felt entitled to make up for her loss of time by leaving me with her parents to go live her best life like my father. She did drugs and drank and broke her parents' hearts. She tried her best to ignore me and responsibility in general. All the while, my grandparents took up the mantle of parenthood in their places. They were good at it. Even though we never had much money, I never wanted for much. My childhood, during their time as my parents, was rich and full of love. What I lacked in financial advantage was more than made up for with kindness, patience, and unconditional love. My summer days were the best. Walks with my grandmother down the long, dusty lane they built their house beside. We'd collect discarded cans from drivers doing some late-night rendezvous down at the end of that dirt road. It ended on a hill after about 2 miles into the woods, and the hill gave a scenic view of the woods and farms further on. It became a local lover's lane for young couples feeling amorous, much to my grandparents' dismay. Me and Mum would walk that lane collecting the cans they'd toss from their cars and make a weekly trip to the recycling yard in her beat-up little Dodge Omni, then collect the few bucks our bags of cans awarded us. She'd then let me use that money to pick out movies at the video store, $5 for a new release, or 5 old movies for the same price. Or she'd take me to the Dav thrift store, where those couple bucks would get me my pick of a ton of second-hand toys, or trips to the library, where I could pick out books that she'd later read to me before bed. That jump-started my lifelong passion of reading, all that while my grandfather worked long hours at the steel mill in Baltimore, an hour commute away. When he got home, I was always impatiently waiting at the driveway by the garage. He'd come ambling out of his Warlock truck, usually with a pocket full of Werther's hard candy, and scoop me up in his big tattooed arms and swing me around as I laughed. It ended in a big hug, and I will never forget the smell of his aftershave, that ancient Old Spice that came in a little porcelain bottle with the stopper on top. Sometimes he'd rub his stubbly cheek onto mine and yell, I got a sandpaper face, booba. Everything about him signified strength to me, his rugged biceps rippling with muscle, the faded navy tattoos, including the obligatory anchor, his manly chest hair so coarse against my face when I hugged him, and the way the crucifix he wore on a little chain sometimes got lost in the thicket of salt and pepper hairs. He was so strong, so alive, like he'd always been and always would be. Even his sparse, thinning hair on his head seemed full of vitality, as if it'd always be there too. The thick, goopy stuff he scooped out of the little can to slick it back in that old style just seemed to make him so cool to young me. Like James Dean, his hair, but thinner. Like an elder Dean with more life experience and grown even tougher. If he wasn't too tired, we'd grab our walking sticks, which he'd shown me how to cut, whittle and carve designs on, and take a little hike in the woods behind his house. Or he'd spend some time pushing me up and down the little hills in the front yard on my big wheel. Or we'd get some buckets and scoop minnows out of the crick out back. Sometimes we would snatch frogs from the pond in the large field on the west side of the property, or he'd show me how to impale wriggling bloodworms onto sharp hooks and fish some sunnies from that pond. Each activity made me love him more. Every lesson he taught me added to the respect I held for him in my heart. It was during one of those pond fishing trips that I asked about the war. We had been laughing and talking about his old war buddy, a crazy old Italian guy named Johnny Corso, who always lied like a rug, and how he'd been convinced mermaids were real by the tall tales sailors would tell him over drinks on shore leave R&R. How he'd always start telling lies about mermaids once he'd had a beer or two. Talking about Johnny, I remembered that my grandfather had met him in the war. I started to wonder how someone so loud and full of shit like Johnny could become friends with someone as no-nonsense and comparatively reserved as my pop. I tried to imagine what kind of circumstances would lead to these polar opposites becoming so close. So I asked about the war, in my naive, 8-year-old way. Why did you guys be friends? What happened in the war, Pop? I watched the smile fade from his eyes, as the look washed all the emotion from his usually smiley, expressive eyes, the look that came on like storm clouds as he hurriedly changed channels when a war movie was on TV, the look that robbed the room of energy when someone mentioned his time in the service. Something about the look that made me a little afraid of him. With all the power of wisdom of adulthood and hindsight and my own life experience since, I know exactly what that look is now. Shell shock, PTSD, trauma, carrying an unwilling mind back through the years to a time that is always waiting in the dark, for a flash of memory to light it up in the consciousness like the spark that starts the forest fire. I'll never forget what he said after a seeming eternity of silence while the look paralyzed his face in our conversation. Bubba, I love you so very much. I want you to make Pop a promise. I want you to promise me that you'll never join up. The military is no place for decent boys. I wished I never joined up. I want you to remember that. My time in the military broke a piece of me forever, and that piece can't be fixed. You promise me, Mark. The seriousness was immediately apparent to me, little boy or not. He only ever called me by my name when the situation was serious. The last time he'd called me Mark was when we'd taken his little fishing boat out off the coast of Ocean City, when the storm clouds unleashed great, terrifying waterspouts, lightning and drenching rain all at once, when the waves started breaking over the bow of our boat as we were still a few miles from shore, when he handed me the bucket and said, "You need to bail out the water lickety-split, Mark, fast as you can, keep going and don't stop." That's the first time I reckoned with the idea of my own mortality. It wasn't even Mother Nature's fury that put the fear in me. It was the deadly seriousness in his voice, and his choice of discarding my nicknames in the moment. I looked into his blue eyes, that day by the pond, and saw them transform. Like a clear summer sky suddenly hidden behind roiling storm clouds, there was a strange flat light reminiscent of cold steel there, the weight of the thoughts on those eyes just then cutting through the middle of our good day like a lightning strike. I promise, Poppy, I will never do that. My little kid voice squeaked out the last few words as I felt like I might cry. I knew then never to ask about the war or his time in it ever again. Funny though, I don't remember what the rest of that day was like. I picked up pieces of his war experiences through snatches of conversations I listened to over the years. Adults forget sometimes that kids are around, especially back in the 80s, so sometimes at family gatherings and the like, I would overhear little tidbits of this or that. How my grandfather had a brother who came home from the war in a coffin with an American flag draped over it. How he'd lost more friends to shark attacks than to Korean bullets and bayonets. How he came home a different man than the funny, outgoing boy that left home 8 years earlier. How afraid he'd been of the water for a decade after. That it took great courage to buy that little boat and brave the Chesapeake Bay with his friend Johnny just to go fishing and reclaim part of his life that he'd always enjoyed before. I wouldn't get anything resembling the whole story until the cancer had spread from his liver to the rest of his guts, and he lay delirious from pain and morphine in the hospital bed as he lay dying. Before that, the only time he came close to telling me anything was when I'd screamed myself awake from the nightmares that plagued me after the beast chased me and my cousin. I was 10 that summer. I felt almost grown up at the time. I had learned to ride a dirt bike my uncle brought to my grandparents' house that summer. It made me feel like a badass as I tore through the trails me and Pop had made through the woods behind his house. Suddenly, I was James Dean. The woods were my mean streets, and the way the wind made my hair lay flat against my head was like Pop's style too. I got my first real gun that summer. No more Red Ryder BB gun for me. I got an awesome .22 rifle that year. Woe to my enemies now. Bottles and cans stood no chance anymore. The promise of squirrel hunting trips coming soon meant I was almost totally grown up. While my 8-year-old cousin Mandy still dragged around her kid sister doll, I would be a mighty hunter with Pop real soon. That's why I was so happy that day in late August as me and Mandy played down by the creek. The weather was perfect too. The grueling heat wave had broken after a violent summer storm the day before, and the creek was still a little swollen and cloudy with the stirred-up muck. Mandy was splashing and laughing with me as we pierced the surface of the creek with plastic cups, trying to snatch crawdads from the muddy waters. We had an aquarium in the basement that we were slowly adding to, and crayfish were all that was missing still. Everything was perfectly grand and normal right up until it wasn't. I'll always remember the way things changed so fast. Like a cloud covering the sun, like a clap of thunder in a clear sky. Suddenly, the speed and volume of the world slowed down. As I stood on the bank of the creek, time seemed to slow to a crawl. I had time to admire the flickering rainbows that formed between the droplets of water falling from the cup that Mandy held, hovering just above the surface of the water. Seeing the drops causing ripples that slowly spread as concentric rings as the drops fell through air, suddenly thick as syrup. The way sounds were first muffled and then distorted, like a record player that had just been blaring music spinning ever slower as the cord was quickly unplugged. As if the bubble of reality around us had mysteriously popped, a dam of the real world breaking, allowing the flood of a universe composed of nonsense physics to spill through. As my mind reeled from the senselessness of the sudden and inexplicable slowdown of time around us, a new, disturbing sound shuddered its way into my ears. An alien sound, foreign to my experience, something primal and dark and almost hungry. At first, my brain tried to identify it as a pig. It was a low-frequency grunting, almost as if a great prehistoric boar had materialized in that patch of Maryland woods. As the grunting continued, my brain interpreted it as the weird chuffling grunt of a big bear exhaling sharply. It wasn't any of that, though. It was the sound of something not of this earth, something no living creature makes. As long as eternity, yet as quickly as a synapse firing, the speed of the world flickered back to normal. I think it was the electric sizzle of adrenaline shooting from my lizard brain down my spine that broke whatever spell I had fallen under. Mandy went from a living statue to something again displaying animal motion. The cup fell from her hand, approaching the normal speed of gravity. At the same time, her face started to exhibit the first signs of worry. In that same instant, as something deep in my genetic memory and instinct screamed at me to do something. Danger! Danger! I sprinted the few feet separating me from her and grabbed her wrist. I managed to croak out, "Run, Mandy," as the terror soup of chemicals flooded my conscious mind. In that instant, I couldn't have told you what was wrong, just that something definitely was. I knew we were suddenly in a fight-or-flight struggle for survival. Something about that terrifying sound alerted that ancient instinct that kept my ancestors alive long enough to pass on their genes down to me. Mandy seemed as afraid as me, and ran along slightly behind as I nearly dragged her as we ran as fast as our little legs could go. As we ran full tilt boogie in the direction of the house, I kept involuntarily snatching backwards glances to the creek, then the wood line on the opposite bank, and the bushes lining that side of the creek. Some deep old part of my mind knew where the threat was from that terrifying sound alone. It kept shifting my attention that way, like a prey animal fixating on the yet unseen predator. We probably made it 20 yards into our flight to the safety of the basement door at the back of the house 100 yards away when I got my first glimpse of the horrible thing making that horrible sound. "What rough beast, its hour come round at last, sloughs off to Bethlehem to be born." That phrase shuddered its way up from my subconscious mind at the sight of that creature. That phrase came, unbidden, into my thoughts from some unknown memory in my little boy brain. It was about 1.5 times the size of a bear cub. It had the black, silver-tipped hair of a dog divided by wolf hybrid. The hairs were standing up all over and shook with the motion of the rippling muscles beneath it. Its overall shape wasn't too dissimilar from a groundhog, except where groundhogs were fat and soft-looking, it was hard with muscle and threat. As it ripped through the dense brush and flew into the creek, its lower half of fur clung day to itself like an otter's fur would. On all fours, its limbs bent at the elbows and stuck from its sides as an ape's would, and although its fur was thick, it was easy to see the strength in those limbs. I'll never be able to forget the strange way it moved. With blinding speed, those limbs bent at the elbows in side-to-side motions, propelling it forward in a diagonal trajectory. Something very crab-like how it scurried a few feet left, then right, but always heading in our direction. I've never seen anything move like that, before or since. As that terrifying sound left its terrifying mouth, foamy saliva was blown outward before curving backwards with the speed it was moving. As I ran and kept glancing back, the most standout features were its alien movement and its shiny, needle-like teeth. That mouth was all canines and thick white spittle and red, lolling tongue. The phrase, "blood red. Its tongue is blood red," kept speeding through my head. As my head whipped from it, back to the view in front of me, I frantically searched for somewhere closer to us than the basement door that could provide safety from the thing. Although by that point we were both screaming and shouting in fear, I knew nobody would hear us. My grandfather was working still that day, and my grandma had just walked some garden vegetables to our neighbors down the road. As fast as our little legs carried us, I knew it would catch us before we made it into the house through the basement door. I overcame near total panic to survey the yard in front of us for anything that could hide or shelter us. Luckily for us that day, my pop was a bit of a junk hoarder. The backyard was littered with random things. Old cars my uncle had brought over to work on before abandoning, piles of lumber for construction projects unfinished or unstarted, random appliances in random states of disassembly, the pieces flung around them in weird orbits, nothing big enough or strong enough to hide in. Then I saw the old, rusty 1950s-era HVAC unit sitting like a junkyard monolith, and the smaller, newer but still broken AC unit leaned against it. I barely remember how I got Mandy up on top of the little AC unit before pushing her butt to get her onto the giant old HVAC thing. I'll never forget the sight of the claws swiping the air where my foot had just been as I stepped up onto the top myself, though, or the squealing sound as those claws scrabbled against the metal of the AC unit in its attempt to climb after us. Something primal took over my mind then, as I kicked at the claws, which were like curved black talons the size of a grizzly's, and totally out of proportion with the size of the thing's body. How black and chitinous and gleaming, with what looked all the world like dried blood staining their polished finish. I don't recall finding and grabbing the broken handle to a shovel, just becoming aware of it in my hands as I stared into its dark, shark-like beady eyes, which rolled around in the sockets, occasionally showing flecks of white as they darted between me and Mandy. All my attention was focused on its grabbing claws, the play of muscles shaking its dark pelt, and its teeth frothing with saliva, and that terrifying grunting sound it kept making. I began hitting it with that wooden length of shovel handle. Wet, meaty smacks echoed from the metal we stood on and the trees around us. I remember the foamy saliva gradually turning from bone white to crimson as my repeated strikes started its gums bleeding. And then it was gone. I don't mean it suddenly ran off. I mean it was gone. Poof. Vanished in an instant. A little popping sound and then nothing. No more grunts. No more metal squeal as its claws rakes the metal, struggling for purchase. Years later, reading a sci-fi book makes me think that popping sound was air filling the void once occupied by an otherworldly creature. We stood up there, shaking with fear, and spent adrenaline for a few moments until Mandy finally spoke. What was that? What was that bad thing? I couldn't find the words. I thought about what we just witnessed. It wasn't like anything I had ever seen before, and I saw a lot of nature's creations. Aside from playing outside and hiking and going all over on vacation, I loved animal documentaries, and I had never seen anything even close to that crazy-ass thing. But I didn't need to tell her that and make her more scared. I think it was a dog with rabies. We're okay, it didn't bite us. And then I just hugged her until she had the courage to climb down. I didn't know it then, but that's how she would always remember that day. A rabid dog had tried to get us, but I saved her with a broken shovel. That day continued to play itself out in my nightmares for a few more nights, but Mandy had already put it behind her. She always was luckier than me like that. Later, as I screamed myself awake, it was Pop's turn to come settle me down and get me back to sleep. I know I told you that it was probably a rabid groundhog. I know you didn't believe me. I was just trying to calm down your grandmother. But I believe you, bub. I really do. But it can't hurt you. It's gone, back to wherever it came from. You did real good. You saved your cousin. I'm real proud of how good you did. That was smart, climbing up that old junk. I'm real proud of you, boy. I couldn't believe what I was hearing, what he'd just whispered to me, while I lay in that bed damp with my nightmare sweat, my science trusting no. Mermaids exist. Pop was telling me he believed my impossible story. I loved him with my whole heart just then. I wasn't much older than you back then in the war, he started. He paused, and I could tell he was really thinking about just what he wanted to say. When you're old enough to understand it, I will tell you all I know about these things. I don't know much, but I will tell you all I know. When you're older, you deserve to know. You might need to know. For now, Mark, you just get on back to sleep. You're always safe here. Nothing bad will happen to you here. I love you. Get some sleep. He kissed my forehead and turned out my light and shut the door, and I was able to get back to sleep safe in the knowledge that he wouldn't let anybody or anything hurt me. The next morning, all I could think about was what he had almost told me. So thinking, my mind quit replaying that narrow escape from that terrible beast, and my nightmares finally ended. I loved that man with a fierce clarity and purity that I now only hold for my own children. I thought about how we used to watch our favorite show together. He and I, and even my grandma, loved unsolved mysteries. My grandma, just because she thought Robert Stack was cute, ew, gross, yuck, but we would watch it religiously every Wednesday evening. My grandma was big into the finding a lost family member segments, which I thought were so boring. Me and Pop, though, we liked the weird episodes, the UFO ones, the Bigfoot one, the strange disappearances, the weirder the better. I always found it odd that Pop likes those episodes. He was usually the one correcting my grandma's superstitious beliefs, like when she said, "When it rains while the sun's out, the devil's beating his wife." Pop would always correct her and say that the clouds just weren't blocking the sunlight. She'd swear that when you could see the silvery underside of leaves on trees, it guaranteed a storm was coming. Pop just said it was that storms were when it was windiest. One time, my grandma told me a story about the ghost of Black Aggie, a ghost who people saw crying while sitting on her tombstone in Baltimore. Pop just said she's full of shit. I asked him once why he liked the stranger episodes, and he told me this: "Mark, sometimes weird shit happens, It's like there are holes in reality, and sometimes weird shit comes through. It clashed so hard with the rest of his character that I never forgot it. I wouldn't understand where that came from till decades later. By then, he was on hospice and bedridden. As he lay dying, reduced to a shade of what he'd been, pieces of my heart withered and died too. Watching those strong, powerful hands transformed into something weak and shaking as he tried to lift silverware to his mouth, that child still inside me deep down recoiled in shock and sadness. My melancholy filled that hospital room, turning the air redolent with death into something colder and less harsh. As he lay dying, he had something he needed to tell me. I could see the strain as he spoke through the fog of pain and medication. I signed up at 17, Mark. My daddy died the summer before and Mama was about to lose the house. I watched my brother in his Navy uniform kiss her goodbye so he could send enough home to keep a roof over us, and I couldn't be more proud. I wanted Mama to feel that proud of me too. My grades were shit, she knew it too, so I figured it was the best thing I could do. My sister Rosemary was too young to work, so I figured I would step up. So I snuck off and did it. That's when it was easy to lie and fake your records, and the recruiters just looked the other way, because Uncle Sam needed a constant supply of dummies to pack in their ships and send over there to that terrible place. That's how I met old Johnny Corso. We were placed on the same refueling boat, and his bullshitting and joking helped me through the loneliness of being away from home for the first time in my life. He always had a story or a lie for every occasion, and it usually served to get our group's mind off the horrors at hand. When we were all struck sad after young Billy from Alabama got thrown overboard during a bad swell, he was there to get us laughing with his tales of that Okinawa whorehouse. When that kid from Kentucky lost an arm when our refueling tug clapped against that frigate, he was making him laugh as soon as the morphine kicked in with his stories of GIs getting the clap from mermaids in Honolulu. When we started getting scared seeing those lights out in the deep waters of the middle of the Pacific, he made me cry laughing, saying it was the Polish submariners opening the windows of their subs to let in a breeze down there. Those lights are what I want to tell you about Mark, and what else happened out there in the middle of the ocean where nobody has any business being. I saw some horrible things during that war, but what we went through out on that water filled with killer waves and deep sea monsters was the most scared I ever been. I'm dying. I can feel the cancer chewing me up, but I'm not afraid to die. I'll be with my mama and your grandma soon. It's the thought of going back to that patch of ocean that scares me, and what is under there. Me and Johnny were in our bunks in the belly of our ship when we heard a knocking sound. Sometimes guys would rap on their steel walls with a wrench if the watchman came round, so's you had a chance to stash the hooch or cards or whatever. I knew that sound well by this time. It wasn't that, because this knocking came from the outer hull, not an interior wall. It came from the outer hull, which, where we were, was about 20 feet below the surface. Unless a frogman got suited up in the middle of the night and let himself down there in the dark, shark-infested waters to fuck with us, I had no idea what could be doing it. That sound made me very scared, until Johnny told me to get necked because the gorgeous mermaids were just trying to invite us out on a date, but our laughing stopped once that knocking started again. Since we couldn't sleep, we made our way onto the deck, trying to see if the anchor chain was on our side of the ship, seeing if it was maybe hitting the hull with the rhythm of the waves, but the anchor was up on deck. That's when we got really scared, especially once we realized that we had a crewman missing. We ran out ship in circles looking for him, but he was gone. The very next night, another man vanished over the side. That night, the seas were as calm as can be, flat like glass, lit with a full moon. After running circles manning the searchlights till damn near dawn, we gave up the ghost. 2 men down in 2 nights without a sound, except for that knocking. The next night in the mess, I was in a lively discussion about weird shit. Johnny had just told us all about seeing Foo Fighters lighting up the night and doing flybys of airmen when someone spoke up about those underwater lights. He was saying how sometimes in the deepest water, the black ocean would suddenly spring to life, as bright, dazzling light would shine up from the depths, not like bioluminescent fish, but like the sun got lost and went for a deep swim. Spheres made of bright light would dart up from the darkest depths and swim around under the surface, Sometimes they'd dance in the wakes of ships like dolphins. Sometimes they'd shoot straight up out of the water and streak off into the sky. All bullshit, that's what I thought then, until I saw it for myself that next night. The ocean's surface again flat as glass. The moon still full and bright, hardly a cloud up there. About 200 yards off the bow, I saw a ball of light, seemingly swimming towards our boat. Me and Johnny were up there smoking on one of the lifeboats, just watching out when we saw it. We watched that light swim closer and closer until we could see it just under our wake, seemingly rising to the surface. I about shit myself when I saw the man-shaped silhouette inside the light. It looked like the creature from the Black Lagoon, not the actor wearing a suit either. Like something man-shaped that has chosen to go back in the ocean and had evolved to stay there, with glowing white skin. I couldn't believe what my eyes were seeing, and that's when I realized that all the sounds around us had stopped. No waves slapping the steel hull, no motor noise, no yapping Johnny. As that thing climbed up the slick, smooth hull with webbed hands, my cigarette fell from my mouth, and Johnny clutched onto me like a life preserver. As its scaly legs swung over the deck, we backpedaled as far as we could till we hit the wall behind us. I screamed as the thing grabbed a boy named Luke, who had been drinking near the chain railing. No sound came out of my mouth, or Luke's, even though I could see him screaming. I knew right then what that knocking sound had been, and I pissed myself. When they splashed into the water, all the sounds around us got their volume back. I spent 2 more terrified weeks on that boat. Me and Johnny spent the next leave in a hospital in Spain, after a deck fire burnt us pretty good. Then we were out of the Navy and flown home. It took a long time to go out on the water again, but I would be goddamned if I let fear ruin fishing for me, or you, Bubba. Don't you let the fear win either. Sometimes the reality around us just cracks. Sometimes things slither on through. They don't make no sense, and worrying about them don't help nothing. There ain't no explaining these things. Best to move on, or it'll just drive you crazy. That's what you did when you were little. You saw one of those things, and you moved on. It takes a while. It's hard, especially at night when it's quiet and you're alone. But you can. Your mind is stronger than you think. The nurse came in to change his bedpan, and that was the end of the story. Once she left, he told me he loves me, but he's tired, and could I let him sleep some? He died 2 nights later, and I want to believe he's with his mama and my mum. I want to, but I just can't. What universe produces those terrible things can't really be capable of producing a heaven too, can it? I hope so. I can almost make myself believe it during a great summer day playing with my kids. But at night, I know it's not possible. Take someone with you, my manager calls to me as she clears the final dining table. I work at a fairly nice restaurant. Steak and ribs is the place's specialty, and mine is liquor. I man the bar most nights. I just finished loading the remainder of the empty bottles, cartons and broken glasses into a medium-sized crate, hoisting it into a trolley just outside the building, ready to close for the night. What? I call out to my manager. She abandons her tray of glassware and walks over. Take someone with you to the bins, okay? She returns to her duties before I even have a chance to respond. I look over to the bar. Stanley, who doesn't really talk to anyone, is busy polishing cutlery, judging Abby's attempts at cleaning the coffee machine with snarky jabs. She's not taking his shit, and gives back what he's dishing out. She turns around and Stanley, feeling safe, flips her off. To my right, I watch Rana mop the floor. He's quite focused and a hardcore clean freak, which makes his mopping both calming meditation and serious torture for him. One dirty footprint and I'm finished. Sitting down doing fuck all is Will. We all hate Will. Even if I asked him, he'd say some stupid shit like, "I can't, my mum will be here soon to pick me up." The guy drives. We all know he drives himself here. I scan the room one final time before saying, "Fuck it," and start pushing the trolley to the bins. It'll be quick. Plus. The restaurant is just one small part of a very large shopping centre. It sits on the outside of the building, which is situated just by a small fountain. Through the day, you'd see a plethora of families and couples doing their shopping, getting food or coffee, or just loitering the surrounding areas. But at night, it was a ghost town. 30 meters up from the restaurant is a large metal gate which leads down into a shared disposal area. All of the restaurants use it. It's quite dark down there, and the mix of putrid smells and scampering rats makes for a fairly heinous adventure down the ramp. About 12 trolleys are scattered by the large industrial containers, relics of past bin runs. A single light flickers up on the wall, and beside it, a security camera, busted. Abby tells me a couple of teens were seen tossing bottles at the wall, one successfully smashing the camera's lens, though instead of running away, they continued to throw them. Very ballsy. I lift one of the 3 full crates up into my arms and continue the momentum up, over, and into the large green recycling bin. The glass bottles make a jarring crash, delivering an unpleasant ringing to my left ear. I take a moment to orientate myself, the high-pitched squealing sending my sense of gravity through a loop. It happens every time, and yet I refuse to slow down the pace. I toss the crate back into the trolley. I just want to get home. The strange thing tonight is that the sound began to morph. At first an intense, constant and debilitating scream, then it was a light whisper. It was raspy, but had a sweet lightness in its upward inflection. It was comforting in comparison to the short-lived tinnitus. This sound, however, lasted longer, with large intervals between each soothing call. It also sounded like words, or just one word. Hey! I spin my head to the left and jump back a little. Lurking just on the cusp of the light's reach is a rugged man with a face mask wrapped around his chin. From what I can see of the figure, he adorns a green wind jacket with the hood propped up and ripped jeans. On his right foot he wears a large black boot, the kind you wear after a serious injury. His mouth creaks back and forth between neutral and slightly open, like he's about to say something. Each time, his mouth begins to quiver. Hey! The word escapes his uncertain lips. I pause momentarily and just watch the man watch me. Both of us are in awe of each other. He blinks and I blink. He breathes and I breathe. If he laughed, I'd probably laugh too. I scramble to find some words, or any word which could help me escape this endless standoff, and... Claire? He continues the interaction. I can feel myself caught off guard, only a little bit, before opening my mouth. No, my voice is splintered and I clear my throat. Not Claire. I watch his eyes wander slightly downward. The light flickers, and the stranger is momentarily cast into darkness. His face lights up again, and he's staring at me, more bewildered than before. He shakes his head. Not Claire. No, not Claire, sorry. I try to half smile. Oh, the man slowly squats down. Thought you were Claire. He settles his hands over his knees. They dangle at the wrist. I'm supposed to meet Claire. She said she'd be here. I'm sorry. I keep a close eye on him, analyzing the way he sits, almost childlike. There's an air of silent thought. Claire said she'd be here. She did. He looks down, then off to the side before returning to my gaze. You have a phone. I freeze. Again, I'm caught in this awestruck position, and I say, the only thing I can say, what I thought would be best, all things considered. What? Stupid. A phone? He rises back to his 6-foot position. You have a phone, so I call Claire. I have her number here. He holds out his hand, opening his skeletal fingers like some sort of malnourished flower. In his palm is a piece of paper, crumpled and wilting. This is Claire's number. If you have phone, I call her. I catch my breath. I don't have a phone, I mutter. No, I don't have a phone. His hand falls back to his side. He doesn't stop staring. His mouth frowns a little. I need to call Claire, he states. I have to call Claire. She said she'd meet me here. I'm sorry, I can't help you. He steps forward, further into the light. His eyes are dark and hollow, his face a gaunt and grotesque bust, covered with all forms of dirt and grime. The light flickers, and as the lights come up again, he's closer, about 3 feet closer. I need to find Claire. He steps forward, and I slide my hand into my pocket. He flashes the paper again. This is her number. He scrunches it and makes an audible grunt while tossing it to the cracked pavement. As the paper slips from his crooked fingers, my keys slip between mine. He steps forward. He's about 15 feet away. She lies! He barks and points at me with cruel intention. Lies! His black boot makes a plastic crunch as he steps forward once more. He's 12 feet away. No, I didn't. I didn't lie. I tighten my grip, each knuckle armed with its own miniature dagger. Again, she lies. Another step, much larger. I shuffle back and bump the trolley, causing it to rattle a sinister melody alongside the chattering of dirty bottles. I am reminded of my poor choices. Where does she go? He looks around himself, almost searching for something or someone. She tries to run from me. Why does she run? Why? I am 2 seconds away from throwing a flurry of sharp, key-shaped punches when he abruptly stops. He just stops. No more steps forward, he just looks right. His expression is dumbfounded and rigid. I can hear him muttering something. He's unintelligible. He looks left. He shakes his head, then looks right again. He shakes his head again and lets out a grunt. He peers downward, his eyes navigating the pavement. He looks up at me one last time. Okay, bye, not Claire. Without so much as a hint of hesitation, the nightmare nonchalantly hobbles back into the shadows. I hear his footsteps trail off into the inky black, off past the edge of the building. Slowly they dissipate into nothing. The altercation only lasted minutes. The only thing audible was my breathing, which found a sharp edge on its way in and out of my lungs. It was accompanied by the thumping of my heavy heart. Sweat crept its way down my face, and suddenly I felt the exhaustion. Once I'm sure I'm alone, I finally release my keys and start to cry. I hadn't realized how overwhelmed I was until I collapsed back into the trolley and slid down to the asphalt, my legs attempting to support the descent while shaking relentlessly. I whimper into my shirt, the fabric soaking a startling amount of water. I think I sat there for nearly 10 minutes just consoling myself while simultaneously keeping an ear out for a plastic limp. After wiping away any last tears, I slide myself back up, using the trolley as leverage. I turn to face the remainder of my assigned task. 100 different reminders to what led me here. It all feels so surreal to go back to this after what just happened. I turn back around and stare off into the abyss. I worry that if I turn around just for a second, he'll be back, just on the cusp. I look down. The paper. I hesitate for a moment. I look forward. I look down. I quickly move to scavenge the paper, swiping it from the ground before returning. I check the dark again. The paper feels damp and looks stained with God knows what. I unravel the parchment and inspect the contents. There is a phone number on here, although it is hard to make out. I spend a few minutes deciphering the puzzle, and I see 0467895. What? I think to myself, what the fuck? The final numbers make themselves known, although it's easier to see them when you know what you're looking for. It dawns on me. This man, he had my number. My real phone number. This is actually my number. Where the fuck did he get my number? Suddenly I hear footsteps sprint up behind me. I aggressively grip my keys once again and swing them to my assailant. I let out a shuttered squeal before spotting my manager as she jogs down the ramp. I ease up, dropping my fist back down. My manager slows down from a jog to a walk and joins me in the lot. She looks me up and down. She can see my misty eyes and trembling hands. She spots the keys. She sees 2 full crates of rubbish. She drops her head. I can sense the "I told you so" incoming. She looks into my eyes. What did I tell you? She sighs. I said to take someone with you, Claire. It had been raining for most of the day. Yesterday's forecast was for a light shower, but this was torrential. I peeked out the window, and in the darkness of the late afternoon, I could see a river of rainwater cascading down either side of the street. My parents were getting worried about my sister. Emily had spent the day at a friend's house and was supposed to be back an hour ago. Just as my dad was about to get in his car and go for a drive around the block to find her, the front door opened. Emily walked in, dressed in her yellow raincoat. Much to my parents' chagrin, she was holding onto the worn collar of an old, soaking wet dog. The thing was a mongrel, but I could make out the Alsatian in it, maybe some golden retriever. As I tried to work it out, I made a mental note to put dog breeder down on my list of career interests for school. My parents exchanged apprehensive glances as Emily smiled awkwardly and explained how she found him shivering in the rain on the side of the road. There was something about its eyes, she said, that made her instantly feel sorry for the poor guy. My dad knelt by the dog and had a look at its collar. It was battered, its red color fading, and it had no name, phone number or address written on it. My father stood up with a sigh and told Emily that he'd bring the mutt to the vet on Thursday to see if it had been chipped, and for the 5 days until then, looking after it would be her responsibility. Emily beamed at my dad and took the dog into the kitchen to towel it down. Later on that evening, she brought it back into the living room and informed us that his name was Buster. My father warned against getting too attached, but she didn't listen. She spent the rest of the day playing with Buster and sending pictures of him to her friends. That night, Buster slept on a makeshift bed of old blankets and cardboard in the kitchen. My parents prayed that he wouldn't make a mess of the place at night. Emily hugged Buster and gave him another treat before rushing off to her room. In the morning, all was well. It looked like Buster hadn't moved an inch. The dopey guy barely looked up at us when we crowded into the kitchen for breakfast. Immediately, Emily knelt beside him, rubbing his tummy and stroking his fur. I think Emily was too afraid of taking Buster for a walk, just in case she bumped into his owners and they dragged him away from her. The garden had been turned to mud the day before, and there wasn't a chance in hell that my mother would let that dog back in the house if he had a trace of muck on his paws. So he, like the rest of us, spent that day cooped up inside, not that he seemed to mind. My dad cooked up a lamb chop for Buster that night, at Emily's request. It was the most animated I've seen him. His eyes lit up as it was placed in front of him, and we all erupted into laughter as he tore into it. That night I jolted awake. The radio alarm clock on my bedside cabinet informed me, in analog red light, that it was 4:37. I lay there, but quickly began to fall back to sleep. As I was, I could have sworn I heard something moving around in the hallway. I assumed it was my dad, stumbling to the bathroom in a drunken stupor, and for the second time that night, sleep took me. I spent most of the next day hanging out with friends around town. We rode our bikes, threw stones at the windows of the old house on Mill Street, and dared each other to shoplift from the local off-brand gas station. I made off with a packet of apple-flavored chewing gum. When I came home, things felt different, hostile. I didn't want to ask what happened, but before I could slink off to my room, my mother told me. Emily had accidentally knocked over my grandfather's urn while playing with Buster in the front room. I suppressed a chuckle at the thought of how much trouble she'd be getting in. Mature of me, I know. That evening there was silence around the dinner table, broken only by Buster's whining. I woke up again that night. This time I swung myself out of bed. My mouth was dry and my breath left a stale taste at the back of my throat. I wandered downstairs to the kitchen to get a glass of water. I tried to be as silent as possible, not wanting to disturb the sleeping dog. Buster slept soundly in his little bed, and I knew a freight train going past wouldn't wake him. I poured a glass of water and drank it in a continuous gulp. Then an idea came to me. I crouched by the cabinet my dad kept his whiskey in. I opened it, trying not to let the hinges creak. I picked out a bottle and stood up. I gently unscrewed the cap and took a sip. I coughed and choked and spluttered. As I went for another sip, I heard movement upstairs. I knew my father would kill me if he caught me drinking. I hastily put the cap back on and placed it back in the cupboard. I walked out the kitchen, desperate not to make a noise. Just before I began ascending the stairs, I heard the door to my parents' room open. I quickly turned around and hid in the living room. I heard my father walk down the stairs and into the kitchen. My heart was beating like a tribal drum as I hurried out of the living room, and I stepped, agonizingly loudly, up each creaky step back to my bedroom. I thought I had made it, but just as I was pushing my bedroom door open, I heard a voice behind me. It was my father. He'd popped his head out of his bedroom. He asked if it was me moving around. I told him that I'd just gone downstairs to get a glass of water. He told me to keep it down, and before he retreated back into the darkness of his room, I saw my mother stirring in the bed behind him. He closed the door. That morning I woke up with a migraine. Nothing too major, but it was a drawback from what would have otherwise been a great day. My sister was at some dance club, My mother was visiting the solicitor in town, and my father had gone golfing. On this rare occasion, I had the house to myself. Well, me and the dog. I found a strongly worded note on the kitchen table when I woke up. It was left by Emily, telling me how I should feed and entertain Buster while she was gone. I crumpled it up and attempted to throw it into the bin from across the room, missing horribly. I made myself the unhealthiest breakfast I could think of. I took it into the living room to eat while I settled down to watch a film, Dan O'Bannon's Night of the Living Dead. That's how I spent the morning. Later on, I took my empty plate into the kitchen. I figured if my mother saw that I cleaned the dishes, she wouldn't be as critical when she found the crumbs. I walked past Buster, who was slumped in his usual stop in the corner of the room, on a bed of now dirty sheets. In a joking manner, I asked him how his day was while I washed up. Obviously, I got no reply. I remembered my sister's note and set a half-dried glass down while I fetched Buster some treats. I didn't know where Emily kept them, so I grabbed a slice of overly processed ham from the fridge. I crouched beside him and dangled it in front of his snout, teasing him. There was no response, no slow opening of the eyelids, no methodic wag of the tail. There were no signs of life at all. I gasped and put my hand on his stomach, trying to feel it rise with his breath or a heartbeat, anything. To my horror, his abdomen began to compress when I did, like a limp, deflating balloon. He felt hollow, empty. I scrambled to my feet and stumbled backwards. As I put my hand on the counter, I knocked over a glass. It shattered on the kitchen floor, but Buster didn't so much as flinch. I panicked and ran up to my room. I took my phone from my bedside cabinet and hastily rang my mother. It rang for a brief moment before she picked up. I managed to stutter out that there was something wrong with the dog, that it was an emergency. She assured me that she had just picked up Emily and would be home in 10 minutes. And with that, she hung up. I set my phone down and paced around the room. As I was thinking, I heard a noise coming from the first floor. It sounded like someone moving around. I assumed it was my mother, home earlier than she estimated. I made my way downstairs to greet her, hurrying over the creaking steps. There was no one. The door was still locked, and I, as far as I knew, was alone in the house. I heard the now familiar wag of Buster's tail as he came bounding up to me from the hall. I looked at him puzzled as he nestled his head into my leg. I stroked him behind the ears as he mewled low. I then heard the equally familiar jangling of keys as the front door was unlocked. My mother stepped inside, pumping her umbrella. Emily, who was close beside her, ran to Buster and dropped to her knees as soon as she saw him. She hugged him tight and whispered in his flea-bitten ear. I could see her eyes were red, raw from crying. My mother asked me what the big emergency was, and I paused before answering. I explained that he had been unresponsive, but he seems fine now. My mother let out a long, drawn-out sigh as she made her way past us and into the kitchen. She called my name, frustrated. When she saw the broken shards of glass on the kitchen floor, I'd forgotten about that. Emily spent the rest of the day in her room with the dog. At dinner, neither me or my mother mentioned anything about Buster's false alarm. We just let my dad witter on about improving his backswing, whatever that meant. For the third night in a row, I jolted awake in the small hours of the morning. I groaned at the abrupt ending of a good dream, tossing and turning until I found a comfy position. As I tried to get back to sleep, I began to feel a presence. It was the feeling you get during an awkward silence, when you become painfully aware of the other person. I sat up in bed and rubbed my eyes, trying to adjust them to the darkness. There was someone in the corner of my room. I was certain of it. I could make out the vague shadow-covered silhouette standing just beyond the foot of my bed. I was almost paralyzed with fear, but my right hand managed to creep over to my bedside cabinet. I fumbled as I felt for the familiar switch of the lamp. Just before I turned it on, the figure in my room bolted. I recoiled in shock as I realized my half-asleep mind had been right. Someone had been standing there watching. As the moon emerged from a bank of clouds, my room was briefly lit with a dull glow. In that half-light, I saw the outline of a tall man slink out of my room and into the darkness of the hall. I didn't realize I was screaming until my father burst into my room moments later. He switched the lights on, which burned my eyes. He held me and asked what was wrong. With snot and tears dripping down my face, I managed to stutter out that there had been someone in my room. At this, my dad turned and ran back into his room. His caring embrace was quickly replaced with my mother's. He emerged with a baseball bat in his hands, gasping it so hard his knuckles were white. My mother went to check on Emily. She made me come with her, not waiting to let her children out of her sight. Me barged into Emily's room. She was already awake, sitting upright in bed. My mother fired a barrage of questions at her. Dazed, Emily told us that she hadn't seen anything. My father came into the room 10 minutes later. He informed us that he did a sweep of the house and found nothing. No signs of a break-in, no mysterious intruder. He brought me back to my room. Once I was in bed, he Saturday by my side and explained to me that I probably just had a bad dream. He said there was nothing to be afraid of and joked that if someone did break into the house, they'd soon be scared off by Buster, the world's greatest guard dog. Eventually, I mustered the courage to fall back asleep. The next morning, everyone in the family was noticeably tired, even the dog. We greeted each other with yawns and joked about the previous night's events. I didn't know that this was the start of the last truly happy day of my life. My parents went out shopping. Emily took Buster for his first proper walk, and I spent most of the day gaming. It was a normal day. I've had dozens just like it. We had chicken breasts and bland steamed vegetables for dinner. Wednesday was family night. So after dinner we came together in the living room to play a board game. Tonight, it was Cluedo. Buster was curled up at Emily's feet. My father thought then was a good time to remind her that tomorrow he was bringing the dog to the vet and would hopefully reunite him with his real owners. At this, Emily screamed that she was his real owner. She stormed out of the room, Buster following close behind. As soon as she slammed the door behind her, my dad signed. He said he knew my sister would get too attached to that dog. This was the sour note the day ended on. At 10, I did my usual routine. I brushed my teeth, changed into my pajamas and listened to music for half an hour or so before turning over and going to sleep. As I expected, I woke up again in the middle of the night. This time I was too afraid to move, too afraid to open my eyes and see what could be lurking in my room. Instead, I kept them tightly shut and tried desperately to go back to sleep. After laying in bed for what felt like hours but must have only been 20 minutes, I decided to open my eyes. I was filled with a directionless dread as I slowly peeped out over my duvet. Since I'd woken up, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that I was being watched. As I pulled the covers away from my face, I saw who had been staring at me. My bedroom door was wide open, and sitting perfectly still in the doorway was Buster. His head was craned slightly and looking directly at me. I chuckled to myself, realizing that I had been terrified over nothing. I swung my legs out of bed and got up. I took Buster by the collar and began to lead him back downstairs to his bed. As I walked down the hall, I noticed that the door to my sister's room was ajar. I brought Buster into the kitchen and watched as he lay down on the crumpled mess of cardboard and old blankets that he slept on. I smiled as he slumped his head onto his paws and closed his dreary eyes. I wouldn't exactly call him my best friend, but I'd miss him after tomorrow. I turned to leave, to crawl back into bed and finally get some rest, but something caught my eye from out of the kitchen window. I leaned against the sill and looked out onto the cold night. The moon was a perfect crescent, half hidden by the clouds. Light pollution from the nearby city robbed the sky of stars, but as I stared into the darkness, I caught a glimpse of a shooting star. As I gazed in awe to see if I could see another one, I saw someone. There was a person leaning against the fence along our front driveway. I quickly realized it was Emily. I could make much out in the darkness, but I could see that she looked nervous. I was about to open the window and call out to her when I heard something behind me. I turned around and realized it was coming from the dog. I assumed he had yelped in his sleep, maybe stuck in some bad dream, but then I noticed something else. His skin was moving. Rather, there was something moving around just under the surface of his skin. I didn't have time to think what it could be before I saw the long crimson-red fingers protrude from his stomach. They grabbed onto either side of the now gaping wound and parted his abdomen like curtains. Once the opening was wide enough, the unnaturally long arm reached out, snaking across the kitchen floor until it grabbed the dining table's leg. It held onto it tightly as it began to pull the rest of it out. I couldn't comprehend how something so large could have fit inside of that animalistic facade. Eventually, it was fully out and stood upright. The figure must have been at least 3 meters tall. It was hunched over where it met the ceiling. It looked like it had been skinned. Its lanky body was made up of exposed sinew and muscle. The thing's eyes were milk white and bulging out of its vaguely dog-shaped head. It was grotesque. With a streak of urine running down my leg, I turned around and ran as fast as I could upstairs. I burst into my parents' bedroom and stood in front of their bed, screaming and wailing about some monster. They were both shaken awake at my outpour of terror. My father was calm at first. He tried to sit me down and tell me that it had all been a bad dream, like the night before. I pushed him away and tried to articulate between screams that there was a monster downstairs and we had to leave. My father quickly became furious. His anger at me was only amplified by his tiredness. He grabbed my shaking hand and began to shout that at 14 I was too old for this, for any of this. But I was hysterical, and his attempt at reasoning did nothing. As I kept on wailing, he and my mother began to half lead, half drag me back into my own room. Kicking and screaming, I fell to my bedroom floor. I jolted at the noise of the slamming of my door and got to my feet. With tears streaking down my red cheeks, I pounded the door. I heard my father's voice on the other side, pleading with me to calm down. Our shouting reached a fever pitch, and then silence. We both stopped and listened out for the repetition of the noise that had brought our heated argument to an end. The dull thudding noise came again, this time accompanied by a shrill creak. I realized it was the sound of something climbing the stairs. I took a tentative step back as the noise drew closer and closer. In a weak voice, I heard my father stutter, What are you?" I knew what he had seen. I've spent the last 11 years blocking out the memory of what came next. There was screaming and pleading, the sound of flesh ripping and bone shattering. I sat motionless on the carpet of my bedroom floor as viscose blood began seeping in from under the door. The sounds or carnage stopped, and I held my breath as there was perfect silence once again. This silence was broken by the sound of my door slowly creaking open. I was petrified with fear. I could do anything. Couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't breathe. The thing opened my door a crack before stopping. The slowly thudding noise returned as it walked away from the scene, until I couldn't hear anything more. I stayed welded to the spot for a minute or two before grief hit me like a bus. I began crying until my eyes were raw. I stood up and took my phone from my bedside cabinet. I dialed 911 and desperately tried to explain what had happened. I glanced out of my window and my jaw went slack. Walking down the middle of our street was the creature, caked in blood the same shade as its taut skin. Holding its hand and walking next to it was Emily. She stared up at it with affection. The two were illuminated by the streetlights, and I saw that the creature was holding the fur suit that had once been Buster in the talons of its other hand. I watched as they walked down the street, across the sidewalk and into the forest that surrounded my neighborhood. That was the last time I saw my sister. Within the hour, the police came. They cordoned off the area and took me in. I spent the next few years in foster care. The official statement they had given was that it was a kidnapping gone wrong. Only I, and the officers and coroner who saw my parents' remains, knew that it was something much more sinister. That was 11 years ago. Tonight, I finish writing this before I begin a journey that I should have undertaken a long, long time ago. Emily is still out there somewhere, and I'm going to find her. The straight and narrow road plunged into a thick darkness, where summer leaves and long branches obscured the sliver of moonlight that might have otherwise illuminated the road before the curve. Bright halogen lights reflected off rust-covered guardrails as a gentle breeze swayed the green canopy above. It would have been almost relaxing if I had known my location, but the road's narrowness and the surrounding woods kept me on alert. Occasionally, a deer would peek out from the woods beside the road, validating my alertness. I was navigating what felt like a maze of deep southern greenery. Each mile reminded me of my regret for trusting Google's fuel-efficient route. But it was too late to turn back. The yellow lines on the cracked asphalt stretched further into the lush, overarching branches. I hadn't seen another car for miles and was confined to the same songs I'd downloaded on Spotify specifically for such occasions. Another sign, with brown rusted stains overtaking the little yellow that remained, indicated a curve was approaching. I lifted my foot from the gas pedal, gently leaning into the turn. The only source of light came from my headlights as my car seemed enveloped by the surrounding woods. My eyes caught a shadow dancing on the road below, a large figure scurrying, followed by a smaller one. At first I thought it was a fawn and her baby, but they stood on two legs, hurriedly running onto the road. Then I saw it. The larger figure with dark hair quickly grabbed the smaller figure, clenching it tightly. I was coming too quickly to stop as I pressed my foot on the brake. The squeal of rubber and cracked asphalt screamed all around me. I was about to hit a woman and child. I was getting close enough to see the terror in their eyes. All three of us were locked in a sense of oncoming dread. I had to act fast. I grabbed the wheel and jerked it as hard as I could to the right. The sound of sticks, stones, and whatever else lay on the ground next to the road beat against the bottom of my car. It was the slowest and fastest event of my life as I felt my body lift from the seat, battling the seatbelt. I watched my phone hop from the cup holder, smashing into the cracking windshield, and felt the pressure hit my chest like a punch to my heart. The airbag pushed into my body, sending my back colliding with the car seat. I felt all the air pushed out of my lungs as if I had been hit in the stomach. The front of my car went forward, the metal crunching into what seemed like a creek bed. It was such a small body of water, but I felt as if I were under it, as I heard a female wailing into the night. Then a voice cried out, "We have to get out of here." My sight was blurry, but I could distinctly see her dark brown hair plastered to her soft-featured face. Her light grey tank top and sweats were covered in dirt and dead leaves. Her eyes were wide and frantic as she approached, a small figure being tugged by their arm closely behind her. A small boy, dressed in X-Men pajamas, was also covered in dirt and leaves, just like the woman. She finally reached the car and began tugging on the door handle, as if the vehicle weren't sitting nose first in a small creek bed. She kept crying out, "We have to get out of here. We have to get out of here now." The child rubbed his eyes, not sharing the same manic energy. The woman looked at me, her bloodshot brown eyes staring directly at me. I replied, "What the hell were you doing in the middle of the road? You almost got killed and almost killed me." "We have to get out of here. The house has become a nightmare," she screamed, even more manic than before. It took some effort, but I was finally able to push open the door. I stepped out with wobbly legs and a dull pain in my lower back. "How are we going to get out of here?" I answered, trying to shake off the adrenaline, the aches, and the surreal feeling that I had just wrecked a car. "Look at the car. We aren't going anywhere." "Your phone, you have to have a phone." I reached into my pocket and felt nothing. Then I remembered seeing it fly away as if it had bounced off a trampoline. I darted quickly back to the totaled car and began searching frantically for it. It had to be in here somewhere. I shuffled through the wreckage in the darkness as I heard the woman hovering nearby, mumbling incoherently. "Where the hell is it?" I asked aloud as I continued to search. I moved over to the passenger side, which had also apparently deployed the airbag, as I'd not noticed from everything else that had happened. I felt around the floorboard until I found something with a familiar shape. I sighed with relief, but only momentarily. As I looked at the cracked screen, I desperately tried to swipe or press any available button. The screen flickered and buzzed, but wouldn't let me do anything. "Did you find it?" the woman asked excitedly. "I did, but I don't think it's going to help us much. We have to get out of here. We have to get out of here now. It's not safe here." "What do you mean it's not safe?" "We had to get away." "Get away from what?" I asked. "Is someone chasing you?" "I don't know. I haven't seen anything since we left." "Left where?" "Where did you come from?" "My house," she said, sounding almost defeated. I was puzzled by this response. The boy started to sniffle. It seemed the very mention of their home invoked an emotion. I looked at the woman again, her eyes widening with panic. It happened so fast I had to get us out there. "We couldn't get to Grandad either," the boy said again, tears running down his face. "Well, do you have a phone?" I asked. "It's the house." I had to get out there as quickly as possible. "Why?" I asked. "Did someone break in?" She shook her head. "Did a fire happen?" She shook her head again. I was confused. Why did this woman run out of her house and into the middle of the road late at night? The boy had mentioned something about his grandfather being left behind as well. "What about the kid's grandfather?" I asked inquisitively. "I tried to get to my dad, but I couldn't. I was barely able to get my son out before it happened." "Before what happened?" "The house. It changed. It started with a loud noise. It sounded like metal grinding against it. It felt like we were stuck in a machine. The noises that started to come from the wall. It happened so fast I panicked and got my son first. But before I could get..." She sounded distraught. "What do you mean it changed?" I asked, watching her close her eyes as if reliving the moment. The boy squeezed her around her hip, trying to comfort her as tears streamed down her face. The sounds were terrifying, but what was worse was watching metal pieces burst through the wall. The grinding noise kept getting louder and louder, and that's when I ran to get my son. "They came through your walls," I said, raising an eyebrow in skepticism. A hint of anger crept into my voice as I realized I might have totaled a car and died because of a woman's apparent hallucination, like you actually saw pieces of metal coming through your walls. She nodded. Even through her tears I could tell she noticed that I didn't believe her. The boy remained clenched onto her as the three stood of us in silence for a minute. No phone, definitely no car, and out in the middle of nowhere I had to do something. "Where is your house?" I asked, her eyes lighting up with terror. She began to breathe heavily, as if on the brink of a panic attack. Even if she was experiencing a mental breakdown, I saw no other option but to go to her house and call for help, given my own dire situation. "We can't go back," she screamed. "We have to just get out of here." "How are we supposed to do that?" I snapped. "My phone is broken, and if you haven't noticed, this car isn't going anywhere." "We can signal for help." "Lady, you can stay here and signal for help. But if you truly want to get out of here, I can go find a phone at your house, bring it back, and we can call for help for all of us." I don't know if my words finally got through to her, or if it was simply desperation on her part to escape. But she fell silent for a moment. The boy muttered, "Maybe he can make sure Granddad is okay." She nodded and said, "We aren't going back, but the house is across the road. You'll see a small gravel road." I began to walk toward the edge of the creek bed, carefully watching my steps as I made my way up to the road. I turned back to the two and said, "Stay here and try to signal for help, but do it from the side of the road." I worked my way up to the road and took a deep breath. I looked around for a moment but spotted a small rocky road among the trees and began to walk. I found something strange about the silence as I felt the gravel crunch beneath my feet on the woman's way to the house. It was eerily quiet. Not even the sound of a bug chirping in the night or the crunch of a critter wandering the woods. I began to walk up a small hill where I could see a structure in the distance. It was 2 stories and painted a creamy white. It stood on a meticulously maintained yard with low grass and brick flower beds decorated with a variety of colorful flowers. Even in the darkness, I could see bright colors swaying in the light night breeze. I stood outside the house, observing a single white light flickering from one of the windows on the 2nd story. It seemed as though someone had left a television on or a bulb was going out. I walked onto the porch, the creak of the floorboards beneath my weight howling into the silent night as I approached the front door. A light thud came from it as I neared, as if someone were knocking from the other side. "Hello, I've been in an accident," I said. "Are you the granddad?" Another thud echoed from the other side of the door. It matched the first thud in force and tone. I stood silently by the white door, only to hear another monotonous thud a few seconds later. I found it strange that another one followed, and then another. "Is anyone there?" I said, reaching for the door handle just as another perfectly timed thud hit the door. Turning the doorknob didn't get very far. It was locked, and another thud followed a few seconds later. Even if I could push it open, I felt the entrance would be blocked. I stepped away from the door and looked around the porch for a window. I stepped over to take a peek, but saw nothing but pitch black and heard only the monotonous thudding sound coming from the room. I wasn't going to get very far with this entrance. I began to circle the house, looking for any other doors. As I made my way to the back, I saw a small door that seemed to lead to a cellar and a back door. The cellar door was wide open, and I wondered if that was how the mother and child had exited the house before running to the road. It sat there open, the door resting on a bed of green grass. I walked to the back door first, though. I felt it was the right move, considering I was essentially walking into a stranger's house and didn't want to be treated like an intruder. The stairs leading down were made of concrete and didn't creak like the front porch, but they produced a similar thud at the door. Each thud was perfectly timed, following another within seconds. It wasn't promising as I knocked on the door to no avail. I stood there thinking as I stared at the wide-open cellar door. I walked toward it, peering inside to see a faint light coming from the pit of wooden stairs. My nerves felt rattled at the very idea of entering a stranger's home from their cellar, but I relented, realizing I didn't have much of a choice. "Hey, is anyone there?" I said, carefully stepping inside. My foot pressed into the wood, releasing a loud creak that echoed through the dimly lit entrance. I continued to descend further down, each step getting louder and more unnerving before I could see a concrete floor covered in dirt below. It smelled musty, and the walls were bare concrete with shelves lined with tools, notebooks, and mason jars full of preserves and other canned food. I saw a small light dangling from the ceiling, burning brightly to illuminate the room, and a workbench full of tools, with small parts and tools scattered along the painted black wood tabletop. A nice watch sat amidst the disorganization of tools, small gears, and even smaller springs. That's when I heard another thud, though. This one was different. It almost sounded like metal grinding, and it made me think of what the woman had said before. I looked around to see another staircase that looked like it led into the house, but on the wall were two huge gears, slowly turning as if they were struggling. They turned slowly and almost methodically as I walked over to them. The brass color gleamed when the light hit them. They turned slowly, and between the teeth, I could see the red and brown rust. As I turned my head, I could see they were connected to even more gears leading up the staircase. My mind began to race as I tried to understand what I was seeing. Were these decorations? But something broke my thoughts as I heard footsteps. Not the same monotonous thuds, but heavy footsteps coming from above. Someone else was here. "Hey!" I cried out. "I was in an accident, and the owner of the house sounds like she needs help too." I started climbing the stairs. The only sound was the sound of gears moving as I saw a wooden door half open. "Hello?" I yelled out again, being cautious as I placed my hand on the door and gently pushed it open to see what looked to be a kitchen table. A small basket of fruit sat in the middle. It looked and felt normal briefly. The familiar sound of grinding gears greeted me as I stepped into the room. I looked for where they were and was shocked to see. To my astonishment, the ceiling was adorned with a mesmerizing array of gears, each with its own unique shape and size. Some gears turned with graceful ease, while others labored under the strain, their movements accompanied by a discordant screech. The kitchen was like it was split between worlds, one that was what you would expect, cabinets full of shelves, walls adorned with little knickknacks, but the other half was covered with gears that drifted down to the ceiling, taking over the walls. It was surreal to witness as I scanned my surroundings, trying to comprehend what my eyes were seeing. I heard the footsteps again, their source still a mystery. I began to look around the room, searching for an opening that might lead to another room. My gaze fell upon a narrow entrance, where a tall figure stood motionless, its back turned to me. The figure was slender and imposing, sending a shiver down my spine. Fear gnawed at me, and my breathing grew heavy as I confronted yet another unknown in this room filled with enigmatic gears. "Excuse me," I managed to whimper, but the figure didn't respond. Even in the darkness, I noticed its head tilt up, looking above it. However, its reaction was unlike mine. It didn't seem to be afraid of the unfolding chaos in this house that seemed to be made of gears. Instead, it appeared to be analyzing the situation as it began to step away slowly, watching the spectacle. "Hey!" I shouted with more force than the weak tone I had used before, as the figure still seemed to be ignoring me. It disappeared into the darkness with the same methodical turning of the gears. I slowly walked towards the entrance and peered inside. but the mysterious figure had completely vanished. All that was left was a room filled with even more gears. They clung tightly to the ceiling, all turning in a synchronized dance. Some showed signs of wear, with rust staining the brass. The walls were also lined with similar shapes and teeth, all turning in unison. As I cautiously walked into the room, I noticed that outside of the gears was a living room furniture set. An older blue couch sat in the middle of the room, with a dark brown coffee table covered in mail. I don't know how I was able to hear it outside the sound of the gears, but I heard heavy footsteps coming from the second story. Who or whatever it was upstairs. I shuffled around in the darkness and noticed the staircase, gears on the banister, and along the walls leading upstairs. A light was flickering up there, most likely the one I saw from outside. I carefully began to walk up the stairs. The gears ground more menacingly the higher I got. They screeched and howled, and I heard something else. It sounded as if someone was talking. I finally reached the second story to see a hall lined with gears, almost at a standstill, turning slowly and not as easily as the ones I had witnessed before. All doors were closed, but one, and from that door a light poured out into the hall, its color changing. Slowly, I made my way to the source of light when I heard the voice clear as day, saying, "It has to be here somewhere." When I reached the door, I saw the figure again, slowly looking around the room. His head was covered in grey, and his face was wrinkled from age. He was dressed in striped pajamas, strolling around the room looking for something. He didn't seem like a stranger to the house. It had to be the grandfather. "I can fix it. I've always been able to fix it," the old man said loudly to himself, still not paying any mind to the fact that I was looking at him. He began to pace back and forth across the room, looking at the gears on the ceiling and walls. "It has to be in this room. I don't know why I didn't look in here in the first place." "Excuse me," I interrupted the man, who turned around. His eyes were a deep green, dark circles under his eyes, and his arms and hands looked frail. He didn't seem shocked to see me as I stepped into the room. The source of light revealed to be a television playing infomercials on mute, sitting across from a small brown leather recliner. "Did you find it?" he asked curiously. "Find what?" "What's making all this ruckus? It has to be in this room." "I just need to use a phone. Can you tell me where it is?" I asked as he stopped for a moment, looking at a spot on the wall where the gears were barely turning and making a rattling noise. "Can you please help me?" "I can't, not until I fix it. I'm going to prove them all wrong and show that I still got it." "Please, there is a mother and her son scared out of their mind outside, and I was just in a wreck," I shouted as he moved to the wall, observing more intently, studying each motion of the teeth of the gears and how they moved. "Jen and Tommy will understand." "They will understand what?" "That I am still here!" He shouted at me angrily without taking his eyes off the wall full of gears. I moved closer to him to try to see what he was looking at. "The doctors said my mind is gone, but I'm still here, damn it." "I don't understand," I said confusedly, but the man's focus didn't leave the wall. It was like he was transfixed, undeterred by my situation. The gears he was looking at were the most worn and rusted I had seen throughout the house. Each one struggled to make the slightest of motions. "Alzheimer's," he replied, frustrated. "That's what they said I have. They all think I just sit up here and watch TV all day. But here is my chance to fix the problem. I've always been able to fix it. I repaired watches for over 45 years. "What can I do to get you to help me?" I cried out angrily. "Just help me find the problem." "Fine," I said, looking at the area the man was studying intently. I scanned the area but had no idea what I was looking for, but I relented because the man wasn't going to help me until he figured out what was happening. "What am I looking for?" "Anything that would tell you what is causing this damn rattling." I looked around. There were so many rusted gears on the wall. They were like the rest of the house in a variety of sizes, some with many teeth, while others had few. It was like trying to find a needle in a haystack when you didn't even know what a needle looked like. Then I noticed something, a louder rattle than the others in the middle of the wall. It was a gear, the most rusted one I had seen, and it was missing some of the teeth. It only had a few that would occasionally hit another rusted gear that seemed to be cracking in the center. I think I found it. "Where?" the old man asked as he came closer. I pointed at the gear, and his eyes lit up for a second before dimming. His demeanor went from determined to sullen. That would be where it is. Can you fix it? I asked as I watched him back away from the wall and turn around, walking towards the center of the room in silence. He stood there for a minute as if he was deeply thinking of a solution, or at least trying to come up with one. After a moment, he sighed and looked at the recliner before taking a seat, his head pointed at the floor. I walked over to the man, his eyes still directed at the floor below him. I could see tears coming from his face, hitting the floor below. Can you fix it? I asked again with a hint of desperation in my voice. No, I don't think I can. The gears are too damaged, and I don't have the right ones to replace them anymore, he said, shaking his head and sitting up straight in the recliner. Then what are we going to do, old man? I asked, my desperation turning into anger. I need to get a phone, and you said if I helped you, you would help me. He didn't reply, though. His head moved towards the side of me, and he stared into oblivion. Hey, I need you to tell me where the phone is, I shouted. But he didn't say anything. He was transfixed again, but I didn't know what. I turned to see what he was staring at, noticing an episode of MASH was now playing on television. The old man's gaze didn't leave the TV. I snapped my fingers in front of his face, and it seemed to break through the distraction for a moment. You aren't my usual nurse, the old man said, his voice cracking and almost childish. Where is Delia? I didn't know what to say. Gone was the confident man who thought he could fix the problem before, and all that was here was a man who seemed confused. Something else was strange too. The rattling was gone. The sound of gears turning throughout the house was absent. As I looked above and at the walls, I saw that the ceiling was a bare white. The walls another shade of cream, and pictures hanging on the walls of a woman and her child. Today is Delia's day off, sir, I said calmly and gently. Can you tell me where a phone is? I need to make a phone call. He nodded and said, Jenny keeps her phone on her nightstand when she comes home. Where is her room, if you don't mind me asking? Next door over, he said, pointing at the hallway before becoming silent and staring at the television again. I walked out of the room, turning to the next room. It was quiet throughout the house now, as I pushed open the door to see a cell phone sitting on a small table next to a bed with the sheets on the floor from the panic of the man's daughter earlier. I grabbed the phone and turned back to the hallway, walking down the stairs back to the living room. I carefully walked through the house, looking around before I left, but it seemed just like a plain house. Nothing was out of place, nothing was uniquely special about it. But there was one big difference. The gears were gone. The realtor certainly never mentioned this, he said. A putrid scent filled the lounge. It hadn't been there when we viewed the property, but it certainly made itself known once Dad purchased the place. Isn't that always the way? I lack the vocabulary to accurately describe it. It smelt wretched, and that's generous. It was the smell of sewage left to stew at the foot of a festival portaloo, but even Glastonbury's toilets would have been preferable to this. It was more than a smell. Dense, clammy air clung to my skin. It carried something heavy, something vile. Even a shower didn't seem to scrub away those pungent particles. The days went by, and the scent worsened. It breached the living room's borders, wafting through the house. But 1 week after living in our new home, Dad solved the mystery. We moved the bulky, mahogany cabinet away from the corner of the lounge, and he heroically fist-pumped the air, the thick, revolting air. The stench had been strengthening as we waddled the piece of furnishing away from the wall, and the reason became clear when we looked down at the carpet. There lay a damp, mouldy patch at our feet, the source of the god-awful smell that had been violating our senses for 7 torturous days. My dad wasted no time in peeling up the carpet to see what it was hiding, to see what had been assaulting our senses. The last thing I expected was a wooden trapdoor built into ancient floorboards, but that was exactly what we found. Still, we knew that we weren't just smelling damp, rotten wood. Something turned my stomach several times, and it was more than the smell. Do you think the previous owners put it there? I asked in a nasally tone, pinching my nose to seal my nostrils. Mr. and Mrs. Dowdy. They were a little forgetful in their old age, I suppose. Dad shrugged, before bending down to inspect the circular iron handle. But this is a Victorian house. It's been refurbished quite a few times. I'd imagine Mr. and Mrs. Dowdy wouldn't have ever looked beneath the carpet. The two of them must have noticed this terrible smell during their 50 years here, I scoffed, almost choking on a laugh as I inhaled the rotten air. Dad smiled. Maeve, did you never smell Mr. and Mrs. Dowdy? They hadn't showered in a long time. I think they were nose blind. I snorted. Joking aside, the smell must be a recent development. It certainly wasn't like this when we looked around the property, was it? My dad asked, curling his fingers around the handle. I am intrigued to see what's down there, though. Just don't fiddle with anything structural, I said, looking at the cabinet we'd shuffled to one side. I'm fairly certain that piece of furniture might have been holding the ceiling up. The trapdoor did not creak, but screamed as it opened, a high-pitched shriek of relief at having been uncovered after heaven knows how many decades of neglect. I reflexively moved my hands to my ears, but quickly realized that the stench was worse than the deafening groan of the old iron hinges, and quickly moved one hand back to my nose. Jesus wept, my dad spluttered, pulling out his phone. At least put a peg over your nose, I said. Who knows what you're inhaling? He turned on the torch, cast it into the hole, then uttered a meek hum of curiosity. Water, he said. I looked over the edge of the square-shaped opening. Below, there swam water so thick and revolting that it revealed only our disgusted reflections. However, for a moment, the opaque sludge bulged, as if something were threatening to break the tension of the surface. Might be a burst sewer pipe, Dad suggested. We should probably call someone who knows, I said. Gary, he loudly replied, snapping his fingers. He's a pal. He'll help. Right, I'll close this before we pass out. He heaved the weighty door over, removing the mysterious water from sight, but not smell. Strangely, however, I no longer cared about the awful aroma. In fact, I'd stopped pinching my nose. I was too busy contending with the painful shiver coursing through my body, too busy fearing whatever I'd seen below the water, or rather whatever I'd almost seen. The clotted waste had revealed nothing below its revolting surface. I spent the rest of the evening in the kitchen, even after dinner, when Dad tried to convince me to relax in the lounge with him. Come on, May, he shouted. It doesn't smell that bad in here. Well, it probably does, but I think my nerves have been obliterated at this point. I eventually summoned the courage to enter the living room. I'm going to bed. At 9:30? Dad asked. I've not seen you go to bed before midnight in years. I tried to ignore that damp patch of carpet, but the goose pimples on my nape were too present. I twisted, shooting an accusatory glare at the corner of the carpet, and my breathing steadied slightly. There was nothing on the carpet but that foul-smelling stain. Gary's coming over first thing in the morning, Dad promised, noticing my haunted eyes. He'll have a proper look under there, and he won't leave until he's found some sort of solution. I spent the next few hours lying in my unlit bedroom and doom-scrolling on Reddit, hoping that a healthy dose of brain rot might quell that persistent fear beneath the sludgy surface of my mind. Did I really see something in the water? I didn't know whether I wanted an answer to that question. When Dad came up to bed, the house fell silent, and my dread amplified. There was nobody to keep an eye on the lounge's carpet, and that was all I thought when the sound of rustling woke me at 5 in the morning, shortly before dawn. The sound of something shuffling against the carpet, not large, booming footsteps. It was the sound of something swimming through the carpet bristles on the upstairs landing. I would have chalked it up to my father sleepwalking, as he was prone to doing that, but there were no creaking floorboards. It was a horribly quiet noise. I didn't want to find the source, but I was terrified of it finding me. I shuffled out of bed on unwilling legs and tentatively opened the door. Then my lips followed suit as I uttered a meek sound of terror. A wet, slimy trail ran along the entire length of the landing. It stopped at the end of the hallway, curved, and returned to the stairs. Given the repellent smell, I knew it originated from that dreadful place below the carpet, below our home. With quaking limbs, I tiptoed around the wet streaks, not wanting my bare toes to touch the unknown substance, and when I reached the top of the landing, I stopped. I was halted by something in the lobby, illuminated by the street lamp glaring through the front door's glass pane. My eyes were drawn to the coat hooks along the wall, the dirty mat below them. There hung a long navy trench coat which draped down, resting neatly on a pair of leather walking boots. I knew, even from the top of the stairs, that the outfit was damp. The scent of mold carried up the steps, and there was the telltale sign of that wet trail leading from the stairs to the mat, then from the mat to the living room, to its point of origin. The sludgy carpet streaks told a petrifying story, one confirmed by a sudden sound from the lounge, a wooden door clunking closed. I clasped my mouth to silence the primal scream striving to escape, then I stumbled backwards. My heel pressed into one of the damp trails, and a second scream filled my throat. I thought of what had caused that trail, tried not to think of it. Then I scurried back to my room and slammed the door behind me. I stood with my hands pressed against the wood, holding it closed for the next hour, eyes twitching but barely blinking, as I sealed myself in the room. A lifetime later, I felt the dawning sun pour through the gap between my curtains, but I only dared to take my hands away from the door when I heard my dad leave his bedroom. "Maeve," he called from the hallway, "what is this?" With trembling hands, I opened the bedroom door and eyed the carpet below. The wet trails had dried, and my father was grimacing at the crusty streaks of unidentifiable muck beneath his feet. "Is this from the—" He trailed off, retching slightly. "Did you open the trap door, May?" I shook my head, before taking unsteady steps towards the end of the landing. My dad followed me downstairs, calling my name repeatedly, and I started to shake as I realized that all of the night's events had truly happened. "May, I'm talking to—" Dad paused, eyeing the new trench coat and boots in the downstairs hallway. "Wait, when did you put those there? They look a little big for you." "I think we need to go," I quivered. "You need to go," he said. "You've got work. I've taken the day off to sort this mess. Gary's coming over, remember?" "I don't feel well," I gulped. "Please, Dad, let's go. Gary will understand." "Go where?" Dad asked as he eyed his phone. "Look, if you don't want to be here whilst he deals with that mess in the living room, I understand. Go for a walk to get some fresh air. Just make sure you call the shop to let them know you won't make your shift." "It's not that, Dad," I insisted, quaking. "Those clothes aren't mine. I don't know how—" The obnoxious bray of a car horn interrupted me. "Oh, that'll be Gary," he said, peeking through the window at the driveway. "As I said, May, if you fell unwell then—" "Are you listening to me, Dad?" I interrupted, practically yelling. "Those clothes aren't mine. They appeared last night along with the wet patches on the carpet. Something's wrong here. I heard something. Dad raised an eyebrow, eyeing me with concern. "Those aren't your clothes. I don't—" There came 3 knocks, and my father threw the door open to his middle-aged friend. The plumber showcased a belly optimistically covered by a small t-shirt, and a receding hairline optimistically covered by a disheveled comb-over. "Good to see you, Paul," Gary said, slapping my father on the back. "And little Maeve, you've shot up over the past year. Blimey, back from uni?" "Just for the summer holidays," Dad said. "She's been working at Oxfam." "Oh, aye? The little shop down the road?" he asked. "Dad," I whispered, "may I talk to you for a second?" Gary chortled. "Uh-oh, Paul, sounds serious." "It'll be fine, May," Dad insisted, waving his hand at the coat and boots. "You know I sleepwalk. I probably took Mum's advice in the middle of the night and, I don't know, decided to do a bit of spring cleaning. I don't remember buying half of the things I own." Gary grew somber. "Oh, I'm sorry, mate. I didn't realize you two were talking about Maria." Dad shook his head. "We weren't, Gary. It's just been a strange morning, that's all." "A strange week, by the sounds of it," he said, heading into the living room. "Sweet Jesus, you weren't lying. This place stinks." I fearfully following my dad and the plumber into the lounge, but it looked no different. I wanted to scream at my father not to lift up the trap door, and when Gary gasped, I imagined the worst. "That's disgusting," the plumber gasped, placing a palm over his nose. "Never in my 20 years of—" "Is that sewage?" "No, it smells worse than sewage." "Is it a plumbing issue?" my dad asked. "The only way to find out would be for me to—" Gary exhaled deeply. "Go down there. And I'd rather not catch some horrendous disease. I'd like to calculate the size of this hole first. I need something to gauge the depth." You could use one of my old pool cues, Dad said. They're collecting dust in the downstairs cupboard. I could, Gary nodded, smiling. But would you be okay with that? You'd have to chuck it in the rubbish afterwards. Dad returned with a pool cue moments later and handed it to Gary. Then the plumber, without any announcement, plunged the rod into the sludge. The unknown liquid, which was practically solid, released a squelch as the wooden tool sank into it. I was surprised when the makeshift measuring device thudded against something, as I'd convinced myself that the hole would be a bottomless pit. Only seems to be about a meter deep, Gary said, sloshing the cue around in the toxic water. Now if I just... Oh, I think I've found something. As the pool cue wiggled in the toxic sludge, it rapped against something that clattered loudly, sending small vibrations through the floorboards. Dad wore a concerned expression on his face, but just before he warned Gary to stop, there came a crumbling sound, followed by the rushing of water. The rushing of air. Dad grasped my arm as I flew forwards, but he wasn't fast enough to save his friend. The plumber had already been peering over the edge of the hole, eyeing the draining water with curiosity before he suddenly tumbled into it. We expected the man's legs to lift uncomfortably into the air, expected to see Gary performing some crumpled, cramped handstand in the hole which was, supposedly, only a meter deep. However, the man disappeared entirely into the waste, and then the rushing air ceased, as did the draining water. Dad and I peeked tentatively into an empty hole built from red bricks. A small rusty tap hung from the left-hand wall, but it did not seem to connect to any pipes. It had brought the unearthly water from some unknown place. Clumpy water that had drained through a hole in the floor of the ditch. Gary had knocked a brick loose. "Where did he go?" Dad wailed. "He couldn't have slipped through the hole. That's impossible." Then there came a rumble from the bottom of the brick box. A rumble not from the earth quaking, but from something unthinkably mighty making its way out of Earth's depths. Though it came from somewhere else. I know that now. Another brick fell away, followed by another, and another. Dad shone his phone torch into the opening with a shaking hand, and the pair of us screamed. In the blackness below the hole's crumbling brick floor, we saw a figure crawling up a dirt tunnel, moving with insect-like agility in spite of its large presence. The torch revealed a rotten hand and the sleeve of a navy trench coat. We didn't wait to see its face. I screamed, and my dad yanked me backwards, pulled me away from the hole and out of the living room. Whilst he unlatched the front door, my eyes remained glued to the living room door, and from the hole's opening I saw not a hand, but a long skeletal leg. Its decaying flesh flapped in the breeze gushing up from the ditch, stemming from some horrible underworld that was surely its home. And on the end of the rotten stump was a large leather walking boot that quickly slammed to the carpet. Something was lifting itself out by its feet, but Dad tore my frozen form out of the front door before I had a chance to see what would come. That was 1 week ago. We haven't returned to our home, and we don't plan on doing so. We called the police, but they found nothing when they inspected the property. Obviously, Dad omitted the supernatural details of our tale, as he knew they wouldn't believe him, knew it would only make him seem culpable for Gary's disappearance. Wherever my dad's friend has gone, I pray that he has met some sort of end. To live in some murky, underwater world with that thing in the long coat and the walking boots, that's a nightmare I wouldn't wish on anyone. With that said, thanks for watching, and until next time.